Wise Studies presents The History and Practices of Traditional Hatha Yoga with Dr. James Mallinson. At Wise Studies, we are committed to illuminating the texts and teachings of the world's great contemplative traditions. In this series, James Mallinson, one of the world's foremost experts on classical Hatha Yoga, gives us an in-depth look at the texts, teachings, and practitioners that make up this rich tradition. In this first session, Jim discusses the prehistory that forms the foundations of Hatha Yoga.
Hello and welcome to session 1 of this course, which is an introduction to Hatha Yoga. Now, what is Hatha Yoga? This is a question I ask myself often. I'm Jim Mallinson. I work at SOAS, the erstwhile School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and I'm currently leading a 5-year research project into the history and practices of Hatha Yoga. So yes, I ask myself often, what is Hatha Yoga? And the answer is not really that clear. I have to work from some kind of definition, and the place I start is in the textual definitions of Hatha Yoga. So from the Sanskrit texts which codify its practices, and they were written down. There's a sort of first wave of them from about the 11th to 15th centuries CE. And in those texts, Hatha Yoga is sometimes defined, or otherwise its characteristics are implicit, and its defining features appear to be certain practices, in particular techniques known as mudras. So in the first text that codifies the practices of Hatha Yoga and calls them that as well, is an important distinction, because there's an earlier text which I'll talk about in a later session, called the Amrita Siddhi, which is actually the first text to teach the practices of Hatha Yoga, but it doesn't mention Hatha Yoga once. And so the first text which does teach Hatha Yoga and name all its practices is a text called the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, which means something like the yoga treatise according to Dattatreya. And in that text, the defining or the distinguishing characteristics of Hatha Yoga are 9 of these practices called mudras. Now, they're all physical techniques for manipulating the body's vital energies, and I'll go into more detail about them in a later session. Right now, it's just Hatha Yoga. What does it mean? That's what I'm going to focus on. In a slightly later text, or perhaps contemporaneous with the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, but a text called the Amarauga Prabodha, which means something like the awakening of all the immortals. In that, Hatha is defined, so the Hatha variety of yoga practice is defined as that which is, the Sanskrit phrase is Prabhanjana Vidhana Rataha, so that which is intent upon or focused upon the management or control of the breath. So that's a key feature of it in these early definition, and that's then expanded in the same text. It also says that Hatha is divided into 2 kinds according to whether the focus is on the breath or bindu. Now bindu, again I'll talk about that in more detail in a later session, but bindu is the vital principle in the yogi. And something I should make clear early on in these sessions is that the texts I'm dealing with are almost always, they are always written from the perspective of a male practitioner, and the prescriptions and teachings are aimed at men. We can infer from them that certain places that women were doing some of these practices and were involved in the practice of Hatha Yoga, but the texts are never geared towards its practice by women. Okay, so in the yogic physiology taught within these texts, the bindu, which is analogous to semen, is the kind of key, or one of the key vital substances which needs to be cultivated and protected by the yogi. So yes, in this Amarauga Prabodha text, Hatha Yoga is identified as yoga in which the control of the breath and bindu is paramount. And then later on in that text, it teaches various of these mudras, these techniques which are used for controlling the breath and bindu. And then in the 15th century, there's a text called the Hatha Pradipika. It's often known as the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, but I would argue that that is that's not really the correct name, because that's never how it's referred to in manuscript colophons. And actually, as a little aside, that raises an interesting point. I mean, I talk about Hatha Yoga, and we often talk about different methods of yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Raja Yoga, Jnana Yoga, different, whether it's the yoga of knowledge or the yoga of devotion and so forth. But in those compounds, as they're understood in Sanskrit, the usual way of understanding them is that the first member, so Hatha or Jnana for knowledge or Bhakti for devotion, is the means by which yoga is attained, because there's a sort of ambiguity in Sanskrit between whether yoga is the goal or the method. So actually, generally, when we see the compound Hatha Yoga in text, it means yoga as in the goal being achieved by the Hatha methods. So the text will often talk about just Hatha. In fact, more often than not, they'll talk about Hatha rather than Hatha Yoga, and then they'll examine the methods of Hatha. And Hatha is a very common Sanskrit word meaning force or sort of stubbornness or insistence. And I'll come back to that later on, because we need to bear that meaning in mind as well to understand the origins of where Hatha Yoga has come from, and that's what this session will be devoted to. But in the Hatha Pradipika, so that the name of that text means something like the light on Hatha, or the lamp. A Pradipika can mean a little lamp. The lamp on Hatha, so something that casts light on what Hatha is. And in that text, the defining feature of Hatha practice, well, it actually gives a sequence of the stages of Hatha practice. And the first is asana, so posture. The second is kumbhaka, breath retention. The third of these practices called mudras, which I've already mentioned, these various physical techniques for controlling the vital energies. And the fourth is nadanusandhana, or in short, nada. And that means something like focusing on the internal sound, so the sounds that arise internally in the course of yoga practice. And so those are seen as the four stages in the practice of Hatha. Now, of those four, the first three are pretty much unique to Hatha Yoga. And in earlier treatments of yoga, so in texts predating the 11th century and so forth, we do get mentions of asana, but they are always simple or relatively simple seated postures for meditation. We also get instructions on pranayama, breath control. But again, that's always a relatively simple method of alternate nostril breathing, generally used for purification. But in the Hatha corpus, we get these more complex asanas, and we get these more complex methods of breathing in and out and holding the breath. So I think it's those that are the distinctive features. So the complex asanas, the complex breath control methods, and these mudras, these techniques of manipulating the vital energies. The fourth of, as mentioned in the Hatha Pradipika, the nada, listening to the internal sound, is actually found in earlier texts, in particular texts of the tantric tradition. So we can't really see it as a distinguishing feature of Hatha Yoga, even though it's a very important method of achieving samadhi, so absorption in the self is how it's normally understood. Okay, so that's a brief overview of how Hatha is understood in the early Hatha corpus. There's a later definition which is very commonly cited in secondary sources, in books on the history of yoga and so forth, and that's from a text called the Yoga Bija, which has a verse which reads in Sanskrit, Hakarena tu suryosau takaren enduruchyate. Surya Chandrama Suryogad Hatha Yogo Bhidhiyate. So, and the meaning of that is by the syllable Ha is meant the sun, by the syllable Ta is meant the moon. And Hatha Yoga is so called because it is the union, i.e. the yoga, of the sun and the moon. Now, this appears in this text called the Yoga Bija, probably 14th, maybe 15th century. And that seems to me to be in some way trying to override the actual meaning of the word hatha. The actual meaning of hatha being force or sort of stubbornness. And because the way I understand, and I'll talk a bit more about this later on, though, is that the texts of Hatha Yoga were written for a kind of general audience, for you and me, the regular yoga practitioner, not for the ascetics, so the kind of world renouncers, the classical sort of Indian holy men, who are always seen as the practitioners of yoga par excellence within the Indian tradition. And they are renowned, and I'll talk more about this as well shortly, for their sort of extreme ascetic practices. And that really is the first and obvious sense of the word hatha, kind of something that's forceful, something that's difficult. But that, as the practices get translated for a less ascetic, a less renunciatory audience, that aspect of it gets slowly elided. But at the same time, one must remember that the texts that we have that tell us about the history of Hatha Yoga are really just a very small window onto the history of the tradition. And we have to use all the other sources we can, really, to try and reconstruct that history. And in particular, something I found particularly useful in my studies of these traditions is ethnographic, so anthropological research, because we do find that a lot of the culture that surrounds yoga practice continues to exist to this day. So it's very useful to spend time amongst traditional ascetic practitioners of Hatha Yoga as a means of understanding the historical context as well, because one can assume that in some respects it's still being transmitted and practiced as it always has been. So I do quite a lot of that. It's good fun as well, of course, but it's very informative. And the sort of the meaning of Hatha, the kind of the lived meaning of Hatha, as opposed to the textual meaning of Hatha, was brought home to me at a Kumbh Mela festival last year, so in 2015 in Nasik, when I was walking down to the river with a bunch of Hindu holy men, Hindu yogis, to bathe on one of the main bathing days. And we passed a sign that had been put up by the local council, the local municipal council, a big kind of poster, and it said in Hindi, well, the Hindi reads, Sadhu Ninda Mahapap hai, isliye Jatadhari Hatha Yogi Nagna Adi Sadhuon ka Upahas na Uraye. Now that means something like, being rude to holy men is a great sin, so do not laugh at holy men who have dreadlocks, Jatadhari, who are Hatha Yogis, who are naked, and so forth. Okay, so this is, if Hatha Yoga is this great tradition that's taught in all these ancient hoary Sanskrit texts, as they like to say in India, at the same time, why would people laugh at Hatha Yogis? And that's because the reason why people might laugh at Hatha Yogis is because the vernacular usage of the term, so the Hindi usage of the term, generally refers to these ascetics who do these really extreme, hardcore practices, such as, holding an arm up in the air for 12 years and so forth, or never sitting down. Now, the texts of Hatha Yoga, as I mentioned, first appear from about the 11th century, AD, that is, CE, but that's just the texts, okay? Now, it seems pretty clear that the practices would have been going on for much longer than that, and that's what I'm going to look into now, the sort of prehistory of Hatha Yoga. So it first gets codified 11th to 14th centuries or so forth. But what evidence do we have? What are the likely forerunners of those practices, and who was doing them? This is what I want to look at now. Now, as I mentioned, the kind of the defining practices of Hatha Yoga are its mudras, so these special techniques, which I'll go into more detail about in a later session, and the asanas and special methods of breath control. Now, I won't really look into the special methods of breath control. Actually, there's not much evidence for the specific techniques of Hatha Yoga, some more complex methods of inhalation and exhalation, prior to the writing down of the corpus. Although we know for sure that ascetics were practicing breath control, we have very little on beyond the simple techniques of alternate nostril breathing and then holding the breath for long periods. But I will talk a little bit about that. But the other two distinguishing practices of Hatha Yoga, so asana practice and mudra, we do have kind of oblique, fleeting references to in various texts and travellers' reports. So perhaps the oldest of those is the Pali Canon, so the kind of canonical text of the Buddhist tradition. Now, the Buddha probably lived in the 5th or 4th century BC. The texts, as we have it, so the text of the Pali Canon can't be dated to much before the 1st century BC, but they almost certainly contain information directly drawn from direct experience of the Buddha's life. Now, the Buddha lived in sort of the far north of what's now central India, in the region across the border between Nepal and India. So that area was then known as Magadha. Now, it seems to be, and the great scholar, the great exponent of this theory is a scholar called Johannes Bronkhorst, who wrote a book published in 2007 called Greater Magadha, and he puts forward this pretty convincing theory. I think that it can be tweaked a bit, but that it was in that region that much of the central many of the central principles of what later became understood as Hinduism and other Indian religions developed. So these are principles such as karma, so the notion that your actions have an effect on your subsequent existence, and then the related concept of samsara, so transmigration, in which the soul passes through various, thousands or millions, as it's normally understood, of incarnations before hopefully finally becoming liberated. So this is a third kind of connected concept, the notion of liberation, nirvana, mukti, however that's understood, as liberation from the cycle of transmigration. Now, these are concepts that aren't found in the earlier Hindu texts, apart from the Upanishads. We first see them appearing in the Upanishads, and that's the Upanishads are perhaps also related to this, the ascetic tradition, so the world-renouncing traditions that developed in the region of Greater Magadha. And so we find the teachings of the Upanishads, which are associated with sort of ascetic Brahmins or Hindus, but then there's two other major world religions developed in the same area. That's Buddhism and Jainism. So Buddhism is the religion associated with the Buddha, the teachings of the Buddha, and Jainism with the Jinnas. So these are the sort of conquering masters. They're said to be 24. The last one, who is the main proponent of the Jain tradition, Mahavira, he was probably more or less contemporaneous with the Buddha, so sometime in the 5th or 4th century BC. There are also other traditions. Best known is one called the Ajivakas. Again, we don't have much in the way of information on them, and most of it has to be inferred from the texts of other schools, or almost perhaps all of it. I don't think there are any actual direct writings that have come directly from Ajivakas themselves, but we find a lot of references to them in the Pali Canon of the Buddhists. And these ascetics, so all these various traditions, have a kind of generic term, the shramana. And that means striving. In fact, in some ways, it's kind of related to the concept of hatha. Shramana means putting in effort. It means striving towards something. Now, in this sort of melting pot, in this region of Magadha, where all these various ascetic traditions were, they were it seems that they were all trying out various different techniques of confronting this newly formulated problem. The big problem, the problem that some of these traditions saw as perpetuating existence, and the existence that's understood as suffering, is karma itself. So karma is a Sanskrit word, the root form karman, meaning action, simple as that. So it's related to the English word creation, the same root. But karma is seen as creating an effect which will then cause further existence down the line, further suffering. And so you want to stop karma. This is how some of these ascetics formulated their response to this problem, was by thinking that you had to just completely stop karma. And not only do you need to stop it, you needed to get rid of past karma, because that keeps having its effect. And so it's the Jains in particular who formulate their approach to this problem in terms of extreme asceticism. So they think that by suffering hardship in some way, they will burn up their past karma. It's seen as, it's kind of a bit like a penance in the Christian tradition. Although karma is not necessarily seen as sinful, just a bad thing, because it perpetuates existence. So by doing some kind of extreme penance, the ascetic will burn up his past karma. And also those penances are generally associated, or generally involve, remaining extremely still and effectively doing nothing. So you're not creating any more karma as well. And within the Jain tradition, that manifested in, and still manifests in, it still happens today, not very often, but when it does happen, it's reported in the Indian press and so forth, in the a form of suicide called salekana. So the Jain ascetic will literally just sit down and fast until death, and that's seen as a sort of fairly guaranteed way of achieving enlightenment. And they would adopt, these ascetics, some of them would adopt difficult physical postures, and that would be seen again as a way of burning up past karma. And so the Buddha, he wanders around, and there's various stories that he tells in the Pali Canon, and he reports on what the other ascetics in this kind of really vibrant milieu were doing at the time. And he, of course, also famously tries some of these things. So there, in the Pali Canon, but the Buddha reports that he tried holding his breath, for as long as he could, and he goes into some detail about quite how unpleasant that was, and how he feels that he's being roasted over hot coals because he held his breath for so long. He fasts for ages. He becomes extremely thin and emaciated, and again he feels this great heat build up inside him, or unbearable heat. And yes, as an aside, this is an ancient motif which remains current in Indian religious traditions, that asceticism is associated with heat. The word is tapas. The root tap means to create heat. But the Buddha, and he also, interestingly, when he's trying holding his breath, he adopts various bodily postures. He sits down cross-legged, but also he says that he pushes his tongue back against the top of his and the rear of his mouth, and that actually is then echoed later on in one of the Hatha yogic mudras, the Kechari mudra, in which the tongue is turned back and in fact flicked up above the soft palate. Also, the Buddha talks of ascetics adopting squatting postures, ukkutika padhana, and these are also echoed in the Jain tradition. In some texts, Mahavira, the great and last of the Jain saints, he's said to have attained enlightenment in this squatting position, in which it appears that it's in some way quite uncomfortable, and the suggestion is that perhaps pressure is being put on the perineum, again in the manner of some of the later Hatha yogic mudras. Similarly, the Buddha mentions ascetics who are practicing the bat penance, the Vaguli Vrata, or in Sanskrit Valguli Vrata, which literally means the observance, the vrata of the bat. And that is explained in commentaries as being a practice in which the ascetic, the holy man, hangs upside down from a tree like a bat. And this is our sort of first mention of an inverted yoga posture. And that, again, is one of the mudras taught in the later Hatha Yoga texts. And in some commentaries it is said that, the text, the earliest descriptions of these inversions in the Hatha Yogic text don't say how they're to be done. They just say that you must turn upside down. I'll go into more detail about the mechanics behind that later on. But then in some later commentaries that's understood as either being a headstand or a shoulder stand, or indeed hanging upside down from a tree. They generally use rope or some sort of cloth to tie the feet, so that you're then hanging upside down from a tree in the manner of the back penance. So we see within the Pali Canon these forerunners of what we later see formalized in the Hatha Yogic texts as the methods of Hatha Yoga. And similarly with the postures, we do get early report from the classical Greek tradition, in fact. So Alexander the Great visited India in the latter half of the 4th century BC. Now, we don't have any direct eyewitness accounts from it exactly then, but we do have the history of Strabo, which again, I think scholars date to approximately the same time as the Pali Canon, or at least its sort of codification or writing down. And he mentions a couple of meetings. The first one, Alexander didn't actually meet these ascetics. There's a sort of classic standoff, which is still the way things go today, is that holy men, see themselves as the top of the pile, and they won't go and visit other people. People have to come to them, and vice versa with the emperor Alexander. He wouldn't go and see these ascetics. But he did send some of his emissaries to go and check them out, and they reported that they came across, and I'm quoting here from Faulkner's translation of Strabo's Geography, which was published in 1859, and they came across 15 men standing in different postures, sitting or lying down naked, who continued in these positions until the evening, and then returned to the city. The most difficult thing to endure was the heat of the sun, which was so powerful that no one else could endure without pain to walk on the ground at midday with bare feet. So you see here we have this combination of difficult physical postures and also it being exposed to the hot sun, which again is mirrored in, or is continued in traditions found to this day. India's Hindu ascetic traditions still engage in such practices. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But there's one other example from Strabo's Geography when actually some ascetics did come. Alexander and his army were camped somewhere in what now is Pakistan, Punjab, and the story reported goes as follows. And it's talking about two of these ascetics. The word used in Greek is gymnosophos, so it literally means a sort of naked philosopher. And the two of them, and here now I start the quote, "They came up to Alexander's table and took their meal standing, and they gave an example of their fortitude by retiring to a neighbouring spot where the elder, falling on the ground supine, endured the sun and the rain, which had now set in, it being the commencement of spring. The other stood on one leg, with a piece of wood 3 cubits in length raised in both hands. When one leg was fatigued, he changed to support the other, and thus continued the whole day." So again, we know from these examples, so from the Pali Canon of the Buddhists, from these reports of Alexander the Great's travels in India, and also from certain Jain texts, from the Jain tradition, that in this very early period, more than 1,000 years before any of these practices were actually codified in Sanskrit texts, that they were being undertaken. And so it's not just physical methods or the physical postures that were part of this whole tradition. As I mentioned earlier, there's fasting, there's holding the breath for long periods, as reported by the Buddha. There's also techniques, particularly a well-known one that crops up regularly, is sitting surrounded by fire in the midday sun. So we've already heard about these ascetics that Alexander's entourage came across, who would expose themselves to the heat of the day. A very ancient tapas, or tapasya, as it's called in Sanskrit and Hindi, is sitting surrounded by fire. Classically, it's 5 fires, okay, and the ascetic would do this in the burning sun. Now, the reason I'm talking about this as well is because it's the same groups of ascetics today who are renowned for being the practitioners of Hatha Yoga par excellence, who also still undertake all these tough austerities, these tough tapasyas. So within the Ramanandi tradition of ascetics, for example, which is the biggest order of Hindu holy men today, a fairly common practice is what's called dhuni tap. So tap from this root tap to get hot or to practice austerities, and dhuni means a smoking fire. Now this is a course undertaken by quite a large proportion of the ascetic wing of the Ramanandis. It's an 18-year course with 6 3-year stages, and they practice it for the hot months, so from mid-February or so to June every year, and they will go out and sit in the midday sun, well, for a couple of hours each day, surrounded by burning, smouldering cow dung fires, and they'll meditate under the burning sun. In the first stage, they make 5 fires, 5 piles of fire, and then that increases to, it goes 5, 7, 12, then 84, and then an unbroken ring, and then in the final 3-year stage of the 18-year course, they put a burning pot on their heads. Now, this is a fairly extreme technique, of course, and they also, but quite a few of them will also, at the end of each session of this dhuni tap, they will do some yogic postures. And they'll be doing breath control throughout it, they'll be doing pranayama methods, but then they'll also do some asanas and so forth at the end. So, the point I'm trying to make here is this seems to be the origin of these hatha practices. It's amongst these really quite hardcore ascetics. And just to go back to the point I made earlier, that the word hatha even today is associated with these ascetics who do these really extreme techniques. So the texts of Hatha Yoga were written down in the 11th century. They started then, but as I've pointed out, we can go back nearly 1,500 years and see evidence of the practices being carried out. And also, once the texts were written down, the practices continue to be carried out by these ascetic traditions, perhaps in ways not exactly the same as what's written down in the text. We have to understand the text, as I mentioned earlier, as kind of translating the methods of these ascetics for a wider audience. So now I just want to look for the remainder of this session to look into, again, these kind of underground currents, these non-textual evidence for these practices and these traditions up to the present day. Now, one of the very first texts to detail Hatha yogic postures is actually, again, it doesn't use the word Hatha yoga, and it's a Jain text from about 1200 by Hemachandra, a great polymath, great scholar called Hemachandra, who wrote a yoga shastra. And in the tradition of lots of great Indian scholars, he wrote a kind of root text and then an auto-commentary. He wrote a commentary on his own text, a bit like how the Patanjali's Yoga Shastra is now understood. The Bhashya, the commentary, is seen as having been compiled or composed at the same time as the sutras themselves. So Hemachandra wrote this very voluminous text on yoga with a very extensive commentary. Now, the text itself has been studied quite a bit, but the commentary's hardly been looked at, and I've been looking at it recently, and it has some very interesting analysis or descriptions of various complex asanas, and it's one of our earliest treatments of this. And it also coincides with temporally with a discovery I recently made at a very small town in Gujarat in western India, a place called Dabhoi, where there's a beautifully decorated and fortified gate from about the same time. So the gate has been dated to 1220, and on it we find the earliest depictions of complex yoga postures. So by that I mean, postures other than seated positions for meditation. Now, in Hemachandra's text, he gives various names. He talks about inverted lotus postures and headstands and other difficult positions. As one that puzzled me for a while, he talks about the headstand, and he gives it two names. So one, pay attention to, because it's going to come up later, called Kapali, okay, and the other one is Duryodhana asana. Now that really puzzled me for a while, because Duryodhana is one of the key figures of the Mahabharata, but I couldn't understand why he would be associated with doing a headstand. Now, a student I met in Oxford, and I gave a lecture about this, and he pointed out to me a passage from a later commentary on the Mahabharata, which explains how Duryodhana. There's a famous episode in the Mahabharata when Duryodhana gets Draupadi, who is the queen, the wife of the five heroes, the five Pandavas, the five heroes of the Mahabharata, and he insults her by making him sit on her lap. Now Bhima, who's the mighty warrior, the strongest of all the five Pandavas, he vows that he will smash Duryodhana's thigh. And now the explanation of how he accomplishes this, so that just as we have in the West, it's bad form in a fight to hit someone below the belt. Bhima had a problem because he wasn't, it would have been very bad form to smash Duryodhana's thigh. But Duryodhana, during their fight in the main battle of the Mahabharata war, he sort of pulls a fast move on Bhima, or he thinks he's pulling a fast move, and goes upside down. He's doing some kind of ninja move, and as a result, whilst he's doing that, Bhima then smashes his thigh. Okay, so that's how it's explained. So this is why the headstand is understood as Duryodhana asana, although that name seems to have fallen out of practice, but Kapali didn't. Now, the reason I find this mention of Kapali, the name Kapali asana, which comes from Kapala, skull, so it's not that surprising a name, but it doesn't crop up in any Sanskrit texts at all until 600 or 700 years later, in a text called the Jog Pradipika, I think it is the first subsequent mention in the 18th century. But we also have another mention in the 18th century from the life story of another one of these sort of hardcore extreme Hatha ascetics, a guy called Puran Puri, who has been of great interest to me since I first heard about him. Now, he lived in the second half of the 18th century, and we know about him. Well, I first found out about him because a précis, so an abridgment of his own account of his life, was published in Asiatic Researches, which is sort of the first academic journal to do with the study of India, the first Western influence, which was set up by William Jones and others in Calcutta at the end of the 18th century. Now, in one of the very first editions of Asiatic Researches, we have this précis of his life, and his life's fascinating for many reasons. But a few of the things mentioned in that précis, which was put together by Jonathan Duncan, who was the collector. He was a sort of Raj official in Benares at the end of the 18th century. He makes a few tantalizing references to what was in the original full account, and one of them is about when this guy Puran Puri, this ascetic, as a young man, he's probably a teenager, he goes to a big festival at Allahabad in northern India. Now, it's it'd be a forerunner of the Kumbh Melas. It's not actually, they're not called Kumbh Melas then, that comes later on. Puran Puri, he's taken initiation as a yogi, as an ascetic at this point. And he's sort of decided he wants to undertake some hardcore practice. It's not clear, so it's not clear from the account what the Hindi word is, but we can imagine it's probably tapas or yoga, something related. And he goes off to this festival, and he says that he met this bunch of ascetics, all these gurus at the Mela, and they told him about the 18 Brahma mudras, okay, and that he chose, from these 18, he chose the Urdhva Bahu practice, which means putting your arms up in the air. And he put both his arms up in the air, and he kept them up in the air for the rest of his life, a good sort of 50 years. And he has this amazing life story, which I'll talk a bit more about in a minute. But the tantalizing detail there was these 18 Brahma mudras, and we're not told what the other ones are in the abridgment by Jonathan Duncan. It mentions these 18 Brahma mudras, but we're not told what they are, so it's tantalizing detail. I was very keen to find out what the other 17 were, and by a great stroke of luck, when I was researching a lecture I was going to give on this subject, I came across Puran Puri's original statement. His personal life story had actually been published anonymously in a magazine called the European Magazine in 1810, and thanks to Google Books, I kind of stumbled across it. And in that, we do get the full list of the 18 Brahma mudras. Now, the reason I'm talking about them is because amongst those 18, there are some methods which we would clearly associate with yoga practice. That they are not obviously these, not quite so obviously these hardcore tapasyas, like holding your arm up in the air for 12 years or longer or whatever. And there are other similar things in the description among the 18. So there's the first one in the list is Tardeshwari. Nowadays it's known as Kardeshwari, but it means standing up, never sitting down. And this is something again current among ascetics today, and it's usually done for 12 years. There's another one, Akash Muni, which is explained as fixing one's regard towards heaven and never looking down towards the earth. And we see this represented in Mughal miniatures. In fact, a lot of these tapasyas we see represented in Mughal art. Although this one, the Akash Muni, the always looking up towards heaven, sort of perplexed me and other art historians for a while, until we came across this account by Puran Puri, because you see these guys sitting on the ground but leaning right backwards with their heads over a big pillow, so that they're constantly looking up at the sky. It looks extremely uncomfortable. There are various others. There's one, Dhumrapana, which also is the word, the Hindi Sanskrit word for smoking, but it's not smoking. Well, it's sort of smoking. It's a bit like the bat penance. They would hang upside down from a tree over a fire, swinging backwards and forth. But amongst these kind of extreme practices, we also find number 8 of the 18 Brahma mudras is Chaurasi Asan, which means 84 postures or 84 yoga postures. So different postures in sitting, such as continuing, this is how it's explained in the text, different postures in sitting, such as continuing several hours with the feet on the neck or under the arms, after which the members are returned to their natural positions. And then Kapali, which is a headstand, effectively, placing a betel nut on the ground and standing with the head on the nut and the feet in the air. So if you remember, this is what Hemachandra also uses this word Kapali for the headstand 700 or 600 years earlier. So this sort of, that gap indicates that we have there would have been a living tradition, a living oral tradition of ascetic practice, which we don't find codified in text, but there's a continuity there of at least 600 years. And there's a couple of other things among the 18. There's another one, Chaurangi Asan, number 14, is a particular posture. So it means the pose of Chaurangi. Chaurangi is one of the ascetics or saints associated with the Nath tradition, which I'll talk about in a subsequent session. And that is described as to sit down many hours on the knees, bringing the right foot over the left shoulder and the left over the right, with the arms in like manner over the back, so as to hold the toes of the feet on both sides in the hands, which I think is probably a bound lotus posture. So this is, what this shows is that within these ascetic traditions, the practices that we understand as yoga and the practices that we understand as kind of extreme asceticism, standing up for years on end, whatever, we're all closely associated. And that's something we see throughout the textual tradition as well, from a fairly early period. So in the Mahabharata, for example, which I mentioned earlier, in the context of the Duryodhana asana, it's the same ascetics who are said to practice tapas who also practice yoga. And the methods are, part and parcel of the same idea. They have the same results. Although tapas is generally associated with going for kind of specific aims, specific goals, and I'll talk a bit more about that in the context of Hatha Yoga later on as well. So, but as it's formalized, yoga is the aim of yoga is normally either liberation or special powers, special rewards, special results. And within the literary tradition, tapasyas, these extreme ascetic techniques, self-mortifications, are undertaken normally with a specific end in mind. So these great kings or great sages in the Mahabharata and the other epic stories will do something like stand up for 12 years on end in order that the god Shiva will present them with a great weapon or something like that. But there's this whole complex of ascetic practice and yoga that combines together to create this kind of power within the person of the ascetic. And the techniques of Hatha Yoga, as analysed in the text, as explained in the text, are often geared towards cultivating this power, this same energy that's produced by tapas, but also holding on to it. So celibacy is key to the practices of these ascetics as well. It's seen as the fact that they are celibate and continent and never shed their semen is central to the powers that they are said to accumulate through the practice. So often the gods will feel threatened by the power that's being attained by one of these ascetics. And one of the ways they'll try and stop that is they'll send a beautiful heavenly nymph to try and seduce them, because if the nymph is successful and the ascetic then sheds his semen, stops his celibacy, then all his power goes away. And we can understand the techniques of Hatha Yoga as actually being, more specific physical techniques of A, maintaining celibacy, and B, channeling it into positive results within the body. So when I started studying the texts of Hatha Yoga in detail, so that was for my PhD about 20 years ago, it was with a view. The reason I undertook the study of the texts of Hatha Yoga was because I wanted to use my Sanskrit training to understand better the ascetic traditions with which I'd spent time in India. Now, at the time, I didn't really register the fact. I didn't understand the significance, but the first texts that presented themselves to me were these texts of Hatha Yoga. So I edited, I produced a critical edition of a text called the Khetri Vidya, which is about a key Hatha Yogic practice called Khetri Mudra. But what I realize now is, in fact, it's the texts on Hatha Yoga that are they're the only Sanskrit texts of any relevance to these ascetic traditions. Nothing else that they do is actually written down. It's all passed down orally. So all these extreme ascetic practices, these Brahma Mudras, pretty much all of them, you can't find anything anything about them in text. There's no text which teaches you how to do the fire penance of sitting surrounded by 5 fires in the burning summer sun. There's no text which teaches you, how to stand up for 12 years on end or hold your arms up in the air or do any of these other techniques, which is why it was so exciting to come across the treatment of the Brahma Mudras by Puran Puri. But it also then made me realize, so these things, almost all of the ascetic lifestyle is passed on orally. How to live the life of one of these full-on Hatha yogis is all passed on by word of mouth from guru to disciple, apart from the methods of Hatha Yoga. They're the only ones that we find in Sanskrit texts. And that, I think, is because at some point it was decided that they would be written down in order to disseminate them to a wider audience. So the texts of Hatha Yoga and the practices taught therein, they are the one thing, the one sort of gift from these ascetic traditions, for which India has always been so famous, for which the world has always been fascinated by, that they're the one thing that they have given to everyone else, that they haven't kept secret and locked up within their own oral initiatory traditions. And I will talk more about the actual techniques and the texts in which they're taught in subsequent sessions.
Wise Studies presents The History and Practices of Traditional Hatha Yoga with Dr. James Mallinson, Session 2. In this session, Jim covers the early pre-classical texts that form the basis of the Hatha Yoga tradition.
Welcome to Session 2 of my introduction to the traditions of Hatha Yoga. I'm Jim Mallinson. In this session, I'm going to be talking about the textual tradition of Hatha Yoga. As I mentioned in the first session, the texts of Hatha Yoga only first started appearing about 1,000 years ago, probably the 11th century CE, although I argue that many of the techniques had been practiced for more than 1,000 years prior to then. So what we have to understand as the process of what was going on, there was a body of practice of physical yoga methods, generally for either cultivating tapas, so this inner heat associated with ascetic practice, or for manipulating the vital energies within the body, whether that's breath, or in men, semen is understood as the kind of distillation of the vital essence, and in women, the equivalent is a substance called rajas, very hard to translate. It's something like the sort of female generative fluid. It's sometimes translated as menstrual fluid. That doesn't quite work. But we don't really get much detail. As I mentioned in the first session, we don't really get a lot of information about female practitioners of yoga. Everything's written for and by men, so we just have to infer that. But we do get, occasional suggestions or statements that the feminine equivalent is this substance called rajas. So yes, we have this body of techniques being used by a wide range of ascetics, of yogis of different traditions. And then at some point, as I say, probably in the 11th century, they start getting written down. And the first text in which we find the practices written down is called the Amrita Siddhi. Now, Siddhi, very common word, very common word in the yoga traditions, means something like perfection or power. In this context, it probably also means attainment, because Amrita means both immortality and this substance, the nectar of immortality. It's kind of cognate with the English word ambrosia, which ultimately comes from Greek. So this kind of this rejuvenating, immortalizing substance. And so Amrita Siddhi means the attainment of immortality, or the attainment of the nectar of immortality. In this text, we find three of the key practices of all subsequent Hatha Yoga texts. So these are called the Mahamudra, the Mahabandha, and the Mahaveda. And these are relatively simple. Well, the Mahamudra is a fairly simple seated posture in which one foot is put at the perineum, the other leg is extended, and then the toes, the big toe of that extended foot is held by both hands. And then the subsequent practices, which I will talk about in more detail in a later session, they involve manipulating the breath whilst in that posture. The Amrita Siddhi also introduces various other key principles and structures of Hatha Yoga practice, which we then find repeated in many, almost all subsequent texts on Hatha Yoga. These are the idea of there being 4 stages of Hatha practice. They're called Arambha, Ghata, Parichaya, and Nishpati. So Arambha means the starting stage, Ghata means the sort of activity stage when things get going, Parichaya is the accumulation stage, and Nishpati is the completion stage. And this fourfold structure then gets replicated in most subsequent Hatha Yoga texts as well. We also find introduced for the first time the 4 grades of practitioner, going from the sort of the mrudu, which is the lowliest or the weak practitioner, up to the adhimatratara, so the outstanding practitioner. And again, this gets replicated in lots of subsequent texts. We also find introduced for the first time this key principle of yogic physiology. So this notion of the bindu, which is the vital principle in men, equated with semen and rajas in women. And we find this articulated for the first time in the Amrita Siddhi. Now, when I started work on when I started close textual work on the texts of Hatha Yoga, this was about 20 years ago, 1995, I started doing my PhD at Oxford, and this was a critical edition of a text called the Khechri Vidya, which is a important Hatha Yoga text, probably 14th century, and it deals with Khechri Mudra, a key practice, one of the 9 or sometimes 10, they're counted, the mudras of Hatha Yoga, in which the tongue is turned back and put above the soft palate in order to taste the nectar of immortality. When I started doing that, I'd rather assumed, in fact, I was almost certain, because this is what all secondary literature, what all books on Hatha Yoga told one, was that the techniques of Hatha Yoga derive from the tantric traditions. So Tantra is a huge subject in Indian religion. It's kind of somewhat misunderstood thanks to its 20th century, 21st century Western manifestations. It's not all about sex by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, it's a huge, huge subject, and it's effectively a religion, and as my supervisor for my PhD, Alexis Sanderson, has shown in his work throughout his career, it was the dominant religion of India from about 500 to 1300 CE. So it encompasses everything. I mean, the word tantra in that context really best just denotes a type of text. So the most important texts of the tantric tradition are called tantras. And it's a huge body of work covering ritual, metaphysics, yoga, and then there's extensive commentarial and exegetical traditions on these tantras themselves as well. So the best known tradition is from Kashmir, where in the sort of 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries we get a very high a very intellectual tradition of scholarship, analysing these texts. The texts themselves are not necessarily that intellectual, but these scholars have produced commentaries on them, reading into them various metaphysical approaches and so forth. The most famous of them all being Abhinavagupta, who lived around end of the 10th, beginning of the 11th century in Kashmir. Absolutely a genius scholar who wrote a huge range of extensive works on Tantra, also on aesthetics and so forth. So you can find, as Alexis Sanderson did, you could devote a lifetime of study to the Tantras. It's a huge, comprehensive, many ways kind of coherent religion, we might say, because it does cover just about every feature of what we might understand as religious practice. And so I was expecting, when I started working on the Khetri Vidya, this text on the Khetri Mudya Hatha Yoga practice, that we would find forerunners of it within the tantric corpus. But actually, over the years, as I studied with Alexis, and then even after that, as I continued my own study, after I'd finished my PhD, it slowly became clear that no, the key practices of Hatha Yoga are not taught in earlier tantric texts, nor indeed is the Hatha Yogic physiology, so this central principle in which the bindu, so the vital essence, is produced within the skull of the yogi and is constantly dripping down through the central channel and being either burnt up in the fire that exists at the base of the central channel, or it's being, ejaculated in men, it's being spent. And that process is seen as bringing about old age and death. And the techniques taught in the Amrita Siddhi are ways of stopping this process, of making the bindu rise back up the central channel. So by controlling the breaths within the body, you can force it back up to the head, and so it stays in place, and as a result the yogi doesn't get old and he doesn't die. And similarly, I was expecting to find this yogic physiology within the tantric text, but no, it's not there. So this is kind of the key innovation of Hatha Yoga. I think we need, I think we can conjecture. We can't be sure, particularly in this case, we really can't be sure, and I'm not sure we ever will be, that this notion, this understanding of the physiology of the ascetic, of the yogi, was current for at least 1,000 or 1,500 years prior to the composition of the Hatha Yoga corpus. But I think it seems likely. Okay, so the Amrita Siddhi is the first text to teach this physiology, and the first text to teach practices that then act upon it and can be used by the yogi to make himself immortal and achieve enlightenment, mukti, liberation. Now, as well as being fairly certain, or being as certain as one could be, that the practices of Hatha Yoga were derived from Shaiva Tantra. So by Shaiva Tantra, I mean those traditions of Tantra, the dominant traditions of Tantra, in which Shiva, the Hindu god Shiva, is the main deity. I also assumed that the Amrita Siddhi was from Shaiva traditions. And there are various reasons for assuming that, not least that Shiva does figure in the text. But I've been working on the Amrita Siddhi for over a decade now. I first got hold of manuscripts of it about 15 years ago, and then I was working on other things, and then I started looking at them, I think around 2005, 2004, I started looking closely at it. And I had manuscripts from a library in Rajasthan, in Jodhpur, and they were relatively late, sort of 18th century paper manuscripts. But I could tell from reading them that the text was crucial importance, to make a pun on it. It's a seminal text for Hatha Yoga in that its teachings are repeated often verbatim in subsequent texts, and this became clear to me as I was reading it. But again, I was also convinced that it was a Shaiva text, that that the god Shiva was the predominant, the main deity that the teachings were said to be from, and that the people who'd composed it were worshippers of Shiva. But then about a year and a half ago, I got hold of a manuscript of the text from, it was microfilmed in the 90s in Beijing. It had come from Tibet. And it's a fascinating, even for anyone who's not interested in yoga, any scholars of Sanskrit and of codicology, as the study of manuscripts is known as, find it a particularly fascinating object because it's unique in that it's bilingual. So it presents the text in a Sanskrit script, probably Nepali or East Indian, and then underneath that, the same text is given but in a different script. So one must remember that a script is not a language, and Sanskrit can be written and has been written in probably hundreds of scripts. And so we get it in an East Indian hand, probably, and then underneath that we get a transliteration into Tibetan, and then underneath that we get a translation into Tibetan of the same work. And we get a date at the end of the Sanskrit text of 1160. That says when the manuscript was copied. Okay, and then but then it's curiously we also get at the end of the translation, it's made clear in the colophon. So the colophon is the comments you get at the end of a manuscript, or the kind of scribal remarks. It's made clear that the translation is not of the Sanskrit text as presented there, but the translation was copied from another manuscript. So we've got different sources going on, different things being compiled together to make this one manuscript. And the translator, who's named within the colophon of the Tibetan translation, we know him from, he's called Padma Ojer, and he's a relatively well-known translator of Sanskrit texts into Tibetan. So obviously, from the 7th or 8th century onwards, there was big movement of Indian Buddhism, Indian Tantric Buddhism to Tibet, and there were many kind of ateliers, workshops of translators producing Tibetan translations of Sanskrit texts. So we know this guy from, we know that he was current working at the end of the 11th century. So that pushes, as a result of that, we know that the text is from at least the 11th century, and that makes it, we can be pretty confident for that reason, and also because of the fact that many of its verses are found in subsequent Hatha Yoga texts, that it's the oldest of all known Hatha texts. Now, after getting hold of scans of printouts of microfilms of this manuscript through a colleague at University of Virginia, I read the manuscript closely with a colleague in Oxford, Peter Daniel Santo, who's expert in Tibetan and also in Indian Tantric Buddhism, which I'm not. And as we read this manuscript closely, it became more and more apparent, to our surprise, we really weren't expecting this, and it took a while, particularly for me, for it to sink in, that in fact the text was originally composed by Tantric Buddhists, not by Hindus, not by followers of Shiva or anything like that. Now, there are various reasons why we're convinced of this, not least because there are quite a few specifically Buddhist words, terms, principles mentioned within the text, which the later manuscripts that I've been working from, so these kind of 18th century paper Rajasthani ones, and also we've got paper ones from Nepal of a similar date, they don't understand either. Well, when they do understand the Buddhist terms, they get rid of them. So, they'll change Buddha to Vruddha or something, which means doesn't work in the context, but obviously they're not happy with having the word Buddha in there. Or other kind of more esoteric Buddhist terms they don't understand at all. And so they garble them, or they leave them in a kind of corrupt form. And then also there's things like at the beginning of the Tibetan manuscript, there's an invocation to the goddess Chinnamasta, who later on is quite well known in Bengali tantric traditions as one of the 10 forms of the goddess. She's a sort of quite scary looking one who's cut off her own head and is holding it in her hand as blood spurts out of her neck, and it's being drunk by her own head. But that she is not found in any non-Buddhist works prior to about the 16th century. So for various reasons, it's become clear that the first text on Hatha Yoga was actually composed by Tantric Buddhists. Now again, we must remember that just because something is written down for the first time at a certain time, that doesn't mean it was developed then. It doesn't mean its techniques weren't being practiced prior to then. So I don't believe that the fact that the oldest Hatha Yoga text was written by Tantric Buddhists means that Hatha Yoga was developed and originated by Tantric Buddhists, just that they were the first to write it down. Because what we then see over the subsequent sort of 3 or 4 centuries is the appearance of 10 or a dozen Sanskrit texts on Hatha Yoga from various different traditions. Okay, we can, through close analysis of each text, we can get a pretty good idea of who, what kind of tradition it was composed in. So what seems to be going on is that these various different schools of yogis, and they all, the sectarianism at this point doesn't seem to have been such a big deal. Later on, 16th, 17th, 18th century in India, and by which time obviously Tantric Buddhism has died out pretty much. There's tiny pockets of it left, but it's really insignificant. Buddhism, by the 13th century, pretty much completely fizzled out in India. So they're gone. There are all these Hindu sects, some Jains as well, but predominantly Hindu at this period, and their identities get much more kind of hard and fast in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. They start fighting with each other. I'll talk about that later on, but there are kind of reasons for that. But prior to then, it seems that these technologies were shared amongst different ascetic groups. Now that's a key point. It seems clear to me that the practitioners par excellence and the authors of these texts were from celibate ascetic traditions, but they're then bringing their teachings to a wider, non-ascetic audience. Now, I'll sort of talk. I'll discuss the other texts that appear over the next few hundred years now. So, an interesting one that we can date probably to the 13th century. It's the dating of Sanskrit texts is notoriously difficult because the problem is they like to frame themselves as the immortal or ancient, timeless teachings, normally of a deity or some great sage, mythological sage who lived thousands of years ago. So they tend not to present any historical detail, and we have to just sort of work out, make an educated guess at when the text might have been composed. Normally, so with the next one that I think was probably the next one composed, but the 3 or 4 appear around the same time. This text that I mentioned in the first session called the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, and I date that to approximately 13th century. It's quoted in a text that we know was compiled in 1360, so it's definitely prior to that. And for various reasons, but it's ultimately a good guess. I date it to about the 13th century. So Dattatreya Yoga Shastra means the treatise, the text on yoga according to Dattatreya, and it's the first text to teach the techniques of Hatha Yoga and call it Hatha Yoga. So the Amrita Siddhi, for reasons I'm not certain of, I have hunches, and it's actually because the term Hatha Yoga was being used for something slightly different within Tantric Buddhist tradition, doesn't call its yoga Hatha Yoga. But the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, even though it takes various principles and practices from the Amrita Siddhi, uses the same names as well. So, the Amrita Siddhi, it really, was a sort of benchmark for Hatha Yoga in that the same names, the same structures are then used in subsequent texts. So it was influential. It was very influential among the later texts. And so the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra adopts its fourfold structure of the stages of Hatha practice. It teaches the 4 levels of aspirant, and it also teaches the 3 mudras, the 3 techniques taught in the Amrita Siddhi, so the Mahamudra, Mahabandha, and Mahaveda. But it introduces the practices of Hatha Yoga as part of, they are complementary to, they are additional to and complementary to the 8 limbs, or angas is probably better translated, auxiliaries, the 8 auxiliaries of yoga as taught by Patanjali. Although in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, what we might understand as Patanjali's yoga is actually attributed to another sage called Yajnavalkya, and then the additional practices of Hatha are attributed to an ancient famous sage called Kapila. And if you remember in the first session, I talked about the region of Greater Magadha, where a lot of the principles of what later became understood as Hinduism were developed by these various different ascetic schools, such as Buddhism and Jainism. And Kapila was also closely associated with that region. And so perhaps this suggests a link back through to his tradition. And also Kapila is associated in some texts with kind of unorthodox ascetic religious practices, which again would fit in with the traditions of Hatha Yoga. Now, in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, in addition to the 3 mudras, the 3 practices taught in the Amrita Siddhi, we find 6 more such mudras. And I will go into more detail about the actual techniques in a subsequent session. But they are, so there are the bandhas, there's the Jalandhara bandha, the Uddiyana bandha, and the Mula bandha. So these are 3 locks. Bandha means a lock. And then there is the Kechri mudra, which I mentioned earlier, the one I did my PhD on, which is this technique in which the tongue is turned back above the soft palate. There is the Vajroli mudra, which is a technique of urethral suction. Again, I'll talk more about that in a subsequent session. And then its associated practices, Amaroli and Sahajoli. And finally, there's the Viparita Karani. Now, that literally means the inverter or the reverser. It's she, because mudras are feminine, so Karani again is a feminine word. And it means the technique which makes something reversed, which reverses something, makes it viparita. And so the notion here, again, the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra has this yogic physiology first introduced in the Amrita Siddhi of the bindu dripping down from the top of the head. So the viparita karani, the reverser, uses gravity to stop that process. So if you go upside down, then that will stop the bindu from dropping out of the skull and keep it in the head. So yes, we have in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, Hatha Yoga is distinguished from other forms of yoga by these 9 mudras, these 9 practices. The Dattatreya Yoga Shastra is also the first text to introduce a classification of yoga of the methods of yoga into 4. So we have mantra yoga, laya yoga, hatha yoga, and raja yoga. And that's also a hierarchy to some extent. Pretty clearly a hierarchy, although the last 2, it's somewhat ambiguous. I'll explain that in a second. But mantra yoga is seen as the first and suitable for the sort of lowliest practitioner. And that actually signifies, a split. It shows that the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra sees itself as opposed in some ways to the tantric tradition, in that within tantric traditions, the practice of mantras is central. It's kind of the key practice. In fact, the tantric tradition is sometimes called the mantra marga, the way of mantras, the path of mantras. In the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, mantra yoga is kind of said to be for the weakest aspirant, the weakest person who wants to do yoga. Can be accomplished by just about anyone. You just have to, repeat your mantra for 12 years and you'll get there. It takes longer. The results aren't quite as good, but anyone can do it. So it's kind of being dismissed in some way. And then the next one is Laya Yoga, which here is seen as distinct from Hatha Yoga. In later texts, in particular the Hatha Pradipika, which I'll talk about shortly, the techniques of Hatha and Laya Yoga are conjoined. They're sort of put together. Here it's seen as separate, and it's equated with, I think, 8 or 9 techniques are listed. They're called sanketas. Now, sanketa means something like a sort of secret code, or a kind of secret piece of information that Shiva has taught to his followers. And these are relatively simple methods of meditation. Laya means dissolution. It means a kind of reversal of the process of creation. And so by meditating, one of them is, they're quite bizarre, they're not explained, they only, you get one line on them, it's not really explained what's going on. One of them is sort of meditating on the big toe, another one's meditating on the point between the forehead, another one is lying like a corpse. And in fact, the half verse we get there is replicated later on in the Hatha Pradipika, which is a text that was compiled probably 200 years later. And that same verse, which in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra describes a technique of Laya Yoga, is then reworked as an asana, as a posture. So that's how we get the corpse pose. The corpse pose first appears as a reworking of this earlier technique of mental dissolution. Now, not mentioned at all in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, nor in the Amrita Siddhi, are either the chakras or Kundalini. Okay, and I'll talk a bit more about Kundalini shortly. But in the practice of raising Kundalini up to the skull and achieving samadhi, some sort of meditative absorption, there is also seen in some texts as a technique of Laya Yoga. And then there's Hatha Yoga, which I've described already, how it's taught in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra. And finally, Raja Yoga. Now, Raja Yoga is generally within the textual tradition seen as just synonymous with the goal. You know, it's the royal yoga. Raja means king, often equated with samadhi itself. So it's not necessarily a method of yoga, although there are understandings of it as being a method, and I'll talk about them more when I talk about the actual techniques of yoga in the next session. So the techniques of, in particular, it's associated with Vajroli Mudra, Raja Yoga. So the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, the teachings are said to have come from Dattatreya, who is a rather curious, kind of anomalous, slightly unorthodox deity, but he's a deity, and he's explained in various texts as an avatar, an incarnation of Vishnu. Now, nowadays, the sort of tenfold, there's a system of 10 incarnations of Vishnu is seen as kind of the division of the number of avatars of Vishnu. But in fact, in earlier texts, we often find a system of 24, and amongst them, Dattatreya is normally mentioned. So he's a sort of Vaishnava, god come sage as well. He's also understood as a holy man, a great ascetic who's cast off all care for society and all. He doesn't have to observe the usual rules and norms of traditional society. For example, he figures quite highly, quite a lot in the Markandeya Purana, which is a sort of probably late 10th century compendium of myths and legends, and in that Dattatreya, just to illustrate his sort of somewhat unorthodox persona, he's some young sage boys come across him at his ashram, his home by a holy lake, and they want to get his teachings off him, and he can't be bothered. He doesn't want to give them teaching, so he decides he'll try and put them off by getting really drunk and making love to lots of women and so forth. But they don't give up because they know he's such a great sage. They know that he's so advanced that doing this kind of stuff won't actually have any detrimental effect on him, so they hang out for hundreds of years whilst he keeps partying, and eventually he gives in and says, okay, all right, I'll give you the teachings. So you see, both with Dattatreya and Kapila, who later in the text is associated with the, in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra is associated with the techniques of Hatha Yoga, they're kind of, even though they're ancient sages of the Hindu tradition, they're also, they're not of the most orthodox variety. But the text itself, so the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, is connected with the kind of ancient Hindu tradition. It's coming from a completely different world from the Amrita Siddhi, which was composed by Tantric Buddhists. And then from a similar period to the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, we have a handful of other texts, including, there's one called the Amarauga Prabodha, which is pretty short. It's only 75 verses. So the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra is about 180, and the Amrita Siddhi is about 290. So Amarauga Prabodha is pretty short in 75 verses, but it packs in quite a lot. Very interesting short text. It has been published but just a sort of straight transcription of one quite corrupt manuscript. So in the project that I'm working on at the moment, we're going to produce an edition and translation of that, and of the Amrita Siddhi, and of the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra as well. Now, the Amarauga Prabodha, it reproduces lots of verses and the teachings from the Amrita Siddhi, but it then includes some other elements which we don't find in the Amrita Siddhi. So, for example, it also includes the fourfold system of yoga we find in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra of mantra, laya, hatha, and raja. And as I mentioned in the first session, it's the one that says that Hatha Yoga is all about controlling the breath, or the bindu. It reproduces the techniques of the Amrita Siddhi, but it then does an interesting thing, which is possibly the first text to do it. There's a couple of others from the same period which may be the first to do it, but it introduces Kundalini into the system. It doesn't go into great amount of detail, but it says that these mudras, these techniques, also work on Kundalini, which, if you remember, Kundalini is not even mentioned in the Amrita Siddhi or the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra. Now, Kundalini is first taught in texts of a particular stream of Tantra, of Shaiva Tantra, from perhaps the 9th or 10th century onwards. Now, this is the western stream of Kaula Tantra. It's called the Paschimamnaya in Sanskrit, and in texts associated with the goddess Kubjika of that tradition, that's where we first see Kundalini appearing in texts, along with the system of 6 chakras. But in those texts, we don't find any Hatha Yoga practices. Now, this same Western or Paschimamnaya stream of Kaula Tantra is also where we see the origins of a religious tradition of yogis, of ascetics, called it later comes to be known as the Nath tradition, which is closely associated with Hatha Yoga. And so this Amarauga Prabodha text, at the beginning, it says that its teachings have come from this Nath tradition, and it pays homage to Meena Natha, Goraksha Natha, and Chaurangi Natha, who are 3 of the the most important Natha yogis in that tradition. So this is the sort of one of the first texts to teach Hatha Yoga as a product of that tradition. Now, we have 2 or 3 other texts from this period which are also associated with this Nath tradition. One of them is the Goraksha Shataka, which literally means the 100 verses of Goraksha. Now, this has a rather confusing textual history. Well, the text I'm referring to doesn't. It's relatively obscure. We only have a couple of manuscripts of it. But then another text, which I will mention briefly in a minute, called the Viveka Martanda, later came to be known as the Goraksha Shataka. And in fact, that's how if you look up Goraksha Shataka in books on Hatha Yoga, they'll generally be referring to the text that I call the Viveka Martanda. It's quite confusing. Anyway, the Goraksha Shataka, as the name suggests, is 100 verses attributed to Goraksha, one of the sages, one of the yogis of this Nat tradition. Now, it teaches the bandhas, a couple of the bandhas, which I mentioned earlier. No, sorry, all three bandhas, the Jalandhara, Uddiyana, and Mahabandha, Mula Bandha. But it also introduces for the first time a practice called the Shakti Chalani Mudra, okay, which we then find added to the 9 mudras taught in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra in later texts, so to bring the total of mudras up to 10. And this has a very interesting, curious textual history. I've written an article on this in which I translate the Goraksha Shataka, the text as a whole, because it's pretty clear from the manuscripts of this text that the practice involves, and a Shakti Chalani means stimulating or moving Shakti, Shakti being a generic name for the goddess in the Sanskrit tradition. So, and here it actually refers to Kundalini. Now, it's pretty clear from the manuscripts of that text that what's going on, the technique involves wrapping a cloth around the tongue and pulling on the tongue to make Kundalini rise, because the tongue is said to be attached to a channel that reaches down to the bottom of it is the central channel, and by pulling it, you kind of lift the base of the central channel, which allows the breath to move out of the 2 lateral channels, the Ida and Pingala, and enter the central channel, and thereby the rush of breath awakens Kundalini, and she rises up the central channel. Now, this is interesting from a sort of textual point of view as well, in that the verses teaching this method are found in later texts, but they're not understood. I mean, it's slightly obscure, but there are signs, there are definite hints in the Goraksha Shataka that make it clear that the tongue is where this practice is to be performed. But in the later texts, such as the Hatha Pradipika, this seems to be misunderstood, and later traditions don't really get what's going on, and they try to make sense of it as wrapping a cloth around the stomach or something, and then churning the stomach, or as some means of stimulating Kundalini. And we find that as well in teachings of some modern, 20th century yoga gurus as well. They'll teach Shakti Chalani. They'll teach that it's to be performed by churning the stomach or something like that. So I think this is due to textual corruption and misunderstanding of the textual transmission. So here we see an interesting example of the textual tradition influencing practice rather than practice influencing the textual tradition. Okay, then another text that I mentioned is this Viveka Martanda, again attributed to Goraksha, a very important yogi of the Nat tradition. And in there we get 6 mudras taught, and they, again, similarly to in the Amarauga Prabodha, we also see Kundalini. And if we've had that in the Amarauga Prabodha, Goraksha Shataka, Viveka Martanda, all now introduce Kundalini to the Hatha yogic practice. And that's explicitly stated. So the mudras that we find taught in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra with no mention of Kundalini are then taught in the Viveka Martanda as, well, it's not made explicit there, and I'll move on to this. In some later texts it's made more explicit. In the Viveka Martanda we just have Kundalini's introduced and the notion of her rising up the central channel, and then these mudras are taught. So the kind of implication is that they will work on Kundalini. And in the Viveka Martanda, just 6 mudras are taught. So you get the bandhas, the 3 bandhas, the Mahamudra, Khechri Mudra, and the Viparita Karani, so the inversion. And this is all enclosed in a framework of the ascent of Kundalini through the 6 chakras. So this is the first text, I think, in which the 6 chakras and Kundalini are intertwined with the practices of Hatha Yoga. And then around the same period. Again, we can't be sure, but my guess is probably slightly later. I think Vivekamartanda and Goraksha are perhaps 13th century, and then the Yoga Bija appears, I think, in perhaps the 14th century. And in that text, the practices are quite similar to those taught in the Goraksha Shataka, although we don't have the Shakti Chalani. So we have these three bandhas. And again, Kundalini is central to the techniques of the Yoga Bija. The text is associated with the Nath tradition. Now, the Vivekamartanda doesn't call its Yoga Hatha. We've seen that the Amaraga Prabodha does and the Yoga Bija does. So here we see the kind of first signs of the appropriation of Hatha by the Nath tradition, where they're staking a claim to it. The first text, they don't actually use the word Hatha. They did in the Amaraga Prabodha, and then now in the Yoga Bija, we get this definition of Hatha, which I mentioned in the first session. As I said then, Hatha, the kind of implication, the obvious implication and meaning of the word Hatha is sort of force, really kind of stubborn effort associated with asceticism and so forth. But it's in the Yoga Bija we get a kind of esoteric definition of Hatha, in which it's split into, it's said to be the two syllables, Ha and Ta, representing the sun and the moon, and their yoga, meaning of the word yoga is union, their union, i.e. Hatha, is Hatha Yoga. So that's this kind of overriding of the implicit connotation of Hatha as being, or with extreme asceticism, which is something that the Nath tradition has not been that closely associated with. Now that's it, more or less, for the texts of the sort of early period of Hatha Yoga's formalization in texts. So in the next session, I'm going to talk about when these various teachings all came together and were used in the compilation of a text called the Hatha Pradipika, the Light on Hatha, which was compiled and composed in about 1450 and became the most important, the kind of central text for scholars working on Hatha Yoga, both in the modern period and within the Indian tradition as well. So subsequent pundits who wrote about Hatha Yoga would often refer to the Hatha Pradipika as the locus classicus, we say, the classic location for teachings on Hatha Yoga.
Wise Studies presents The History and Practices of Traditional Hatha Yoga with Dr. James Mallinson, Session 3. In this session, Jim expands on the textual tradition of Hatha Yoga in the classical period, post-15th century.
Hello and welcome to the third session in this introduction to the traditions of Hatha Yoga. I'm Jim Mallinson. In the last session, I discussed the early texts of the Hatha Yoga tradition, so texts dating from probably the 11th to 14th centuries. In this session, I'm going to talk about subsequent works. In particular, I'm going to focus on the Hatha Pradipika, which I've mentioned a few times, which is the most probably the most quoted text on Hatha Yoga in subsequent textual compilations and scholarly analysis after its production which happened in about 1450, we think. Now the Hatha Pradipika, as was first pointed out a few decades ago, is predominantly a compilation. So it consists mainly of verses from earlier texts. And so far I've identified about 20 texts from which it borrows verses. But that makes it extremely useful in trying to analyze the prehistory, the history before it was compiled of Hatha Yoga, in that it enables us to identify the texts which its compiler, who is known as Swat Marama, which he thought were authoritative in the Hatha Yoga tradition. So all the texts I mentioned in the last session, all of the verses from all of those texts are found in the Hatha Pradipika. And there's a couple of other texts which I didn't mention, but which also contribute verses. There's the Khetri Vidya, which I've talked about in both sessions actually, which is a text that I edited. I produced a critical edition of it for my doctoral thesis, so that involves finding all the manuscripts of the text and comparing them with each other and working out what one thinks is how the text was at a certain stage of its development. And just a handful of 3 or 4 verses from that text are also found in the Hatha Pradipika, so the verses which describe the technique of Khetri Mudra. And another text which is slightly hard to date, and I think it probably does predate the Hatha Pradipika, but we can't be completely sure, is a text called the Shiva Samhita, which I translated for the Yoga Vidya series. It's quite long, as Hatha Yoga texts go. It's probably 600 or 700 verses. Very interesting text, lots of great detailed analysis of the chakras and kundalini and so forth, much more than we find in earlier texts. And just to recap, what we find in the Shiva Samhita in particular, not in the Khetri Vidya. The Khetri Vidya seems to actually come quite clearly from earlier tantric traditions, and it doesn't really include the yogic physiology that I mentioned earlier, this notion of bindu dripping and being consumed by the fire and having to prevent that in order to stop old age and death. But the Shiva Samhita does. Both texts, however, include teachings on the 6 chakras and kundalini, and the Shiva Samhita in a very developed form. As I mentioned in earlier sessions, in our earliest formulations of Hatha Yoga, the chakras and kundalini are not mentioned. But we see them becoming increasingly important throughout the development of the early corpus. And it's then in the Hatha Pradipika that we really find that they are the two, which I see these two traditions as emerging separately, but they then become fully melded together in the Hatha Pradipika. They're also melded together in the Shiva Samhita, but like I said, can't be sure of the dating there. We find a more clumsy joining of the two traditions in earlier texts that I mentioned, such as the Vivekamartanda and the Amarauga Prabodha. And in fact, the melding of the traditions remains clumsy in some way, in that they're on some levels incompatible. So what we find with Kundalini's the way that Kundalini rejuvenates, and in some traditions said to make the body immortal, is that she rises up through the central channel. There are ways of doing this through, pressing the perineum with the heel in certain seated positions, using breath techniques, or, as I mentioned in the previous session, pulling on the tongue to raise the bottom of the central channel. And then the breath will rush into the central channel. Kundalini will rise up it, and she will go up to the head. Now, Kundalini is the goddess. Shiva is said to reside in the head, so the two will unite together there, and and at the same time, Kundalini's rise is also seen as a method of Laya Yoga, which I mentioned in the previous session as well. So it's a dissolution, it's a reversal of the process of creation, and it's going back to. It takes the yogi back to a state of kind of primordial oneness, in which the elements have yet to evolve. And that's, as she rises up the channel, we kind of see a sublimation. We have the base, the chakra at the base of the central channel is associated with the element earth, and then the elements get progressively more subtle as she rises up, and then she dissolves in the head with Shiva. Now, in the text that I mentioned earlier called the Goraksha Shataka, which is a kind of a text of the more ascetic traditions. That's it. Kundalini rises up the central channel, she unites with Shiva, and then they kind of disappear, and the yogi enters full samadhi, and it's a state, like death. And that's it. That's the kind of goal. And that, curiously enough, in plenty of yogic traditions, and one might argue to some extent in Patanjali, who in his Yoga Shastra, yoga is equated with citta vritti nirodha, so the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. The highest state of yoga is almost like a state of catatonia, in that the yogi appears dead, and his mind has stopped fluctuating, and that that's discussed in certain texts, certain commentaries. So, for example, there's a commentary on the Khetri Vidya, the technique of Khetri Mudra, in which the tongue goes above the soft palate, is said to induce samadhi. And the commentator kind of says, after a description in the main text of how the yogi looks like he's completely lifeless, the commentator discusses this and says, well, you can actually distinguish it, because it's not a state of death, because the body doesn't start rotting, it doesn't smell bad or anything like that. The body stays looking good, doesn't putrefy. But yeah, it's a condition in which the yogi looks like he's dead. But then that's not the only way that the ascent of Kundalini is dealt with in these Hatha yogic texts. And more common in them is the way in which it's treated in the Khetri Vidya. So Kundalini rises up the central channel and accesses there a store of Amrita, the nectar of immortality. And she then sort of, in the Khetri Vidya, she then sort of reclines there, enjoys herself with Shiva, has a nice time in this pool of the nectar of immortality in the head, and then she goes back down through the central channel, and as she does so, she kind of replaces the elements. The yogi comes back to life, and she also floods the body with that Amrita, with this nectar of immortality that she's accessed in the head, thereby rendering the body immortal, or very healthy anyway, and kind of rejuvenating the body. And so we get these two. This is the more common model of the behavior of Kundalini in Hatha yogic texts, and when that gets combined with the Bindu yoga model, there are some sort of slight confusions in that, and we see this quite clearly in the example of Khetri Mudra. So in which when the tongue goes behind the soft palate, in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, for example, that is said to seal the bindu in the head. Okay, that seems to be the purpose of Khetri Mudra there. But then in the Viveka Martanda and also in the Hatha Pradipika, we get two versions of Khetri Mudra. So we get one in which the bindu is sealed in the head, and the other in which the tongue sort of accesses this store of the nectar of immortality in the head, and then is able to flood. Then, as a result, the body is flooded with it. So these kind of things are quite hard to reconcile. There seem to be some attempts made, and in fact, as early as the Amrita Siddhi, there's discussion of two channels. There seems to be a compromise to me, so whereby there's one channel through which the bindu or the amrita, because these two substances then get equated, the bindu, the semen, and the amrita, the nectar of immortality, when these two paradigms are joined together. And there's one central channel through which that drips down and is consumed by the fire, but then there's meant to be another secret channel which you can use to flood the body with it. But I think that's just trying to make sense of a somewhat confused yogic physiology. So we find this in the Hatha Pradipika, because as I said, the Hatha Pradipika is bringing together teachings on yoga from at least 20 texts. It teaches 10 mudras. So now it teaches all 9 of the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, plus the Shakti Chalani mudra, which we find in the Goraksha Shataka. So it's a total of 10 now. The Shiva Samhita does the same. And even though a lot of those mudras, when they're first taught in the Amrita Siddhi and Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, no mention is made of Kundalini. When they are introduced in the Hatha Pradipika and also in the Shiva Samhita, their purpose is said to be the awakening and the raising of Kundalini. And then it's in the Hatha Pradipika also, for the first time, we find complex asanas, so complex postures taught as methods of Hatha Yoga. The verses, as I've mentioned, just about all the verses teaching practical methods in the Hatha Pradipika are taken from earlier texts, and then some of the framing, some of the explanation and the framing of the practices is probably is composed by Swatmarama, the compiler. And 15 asanas are taught in the Hatha Pradipika, of which 7 are complex postures. When I say complex, I mean there's other ways of non-seated, one might say, or someone else described them as power asanas to me, but they're kind of postures that it would be hard to, or impossible in some cases, to hold indefinitely, unlike seated postures for meditation. So we find, well, the oldest asana, the one that's taught first in any text is Mayurasana, the oldest complex asana, and that's taught first of all in a text called the Vimanarchana Kalpa, which is probably from the 10th century, and we then see it taught in subsequent Vaishnava texts. But these texts aren't, I mean, I wouldn't classify them as works of Hatha Yoga, so it's quite, they're more associated with ascetic, sort of orthodox ascetic traditions of religious practice or of yoga practice. And we see the same teachings appearing in a series of these Vaishnava texts, and then the last one is probably the Vasishta Samhita, and it's from that text, the Vasishta Samhita, which the Hatha Pradipika takes various teachings, including those on the Mayurasana, the peacock, and Kukutasana, the cock. So, of course, these hand balance postures could not be held indefinitely, and that seems to be a quite a sort of quantum difference from previous understandings of asana. And as I mentioned in the previous session, we also find included under the rubric of asana in the Hatha Pradipika, we find the corpse pose, which previously wasn't an asana. It was a technique of laya yoga, a technique of meditation. And that again is a recurrent theme through the teachings, the textual teachings of Hatha Yoga, in that practices which were bodily practices taught elsewhere, not as asanas, come to be included under the rubric of asana. So similarly, the Mahamudra, which is one of the very first Hatha Yogic mudras to be taught. It's taught in the Amrita Siddhi, in which the left heel is put at the perineum, the right foot extended, and its toes held by the fingers of both hands. That then appears in rather later texts as Mahamudra Asana. Everything slowly becomes subsumed under the rubric of asana. There are some, there were various practices within the Hatha Pradipika for which I've not found source texts. So, for example, Matsyendrasana, the sort of the twisted seated position of Matsyendra, who is said to be the guru of Goraksha in the Nath yogi tradition, and he's a interesting character within the Nath tradition, which I'll talk more about in a subsequent session. But we see depictions of him. He's very easy to spot in iconography because his name Matsyendra means Lord of Fishes. He overheard the tantric teachings of Lord Shiva, when he was teaching them to Parvati. Matsyendra heard them when he was, there's various different versions of the legend, but in one of the most popular ones, he'd been swallowed by a fish. So he's inside a fish, and he overhears him. So he's always pictured with a fish. And I'm not sure, a theory I've been tossing around with my colleagues is that perhaps the reason for the Matsyendra asana, this kind of half twist, is because that's kind of one of the few comfortable ways you could have of sitting on the back of a fish. And he's often depicted sitting on a fish with a yoga pata, which is a sort of yoga strap or a yoga belt holding his knees in place as he effects a half twist. So that's another of the asanas taught in the Hatha Pradipika, but I've not found any source text for it, only iconography. An innovation of the Hatha Pradipika, well, at least a textual innovation, are techniques called the Shat Karmas, so the 6 techniques. That means literally the 6 actions. Karma, it's the same word. And these are 6 cleansing techniques. They are, such as dhauti, where one swallows a long piece of cloth and then pulls it back out of the stomach, or nauli, the churning of the stomach. I'll talk more about them in the next session. But they're introduced for the first time in the Hatha Pradipika. But at the same time, we can infer again that they were around early. I don't know of any actual textual references of any sort, or even descriptions by travellers or anything. But the Vajroli Mudra, which we know is taught in a text perhaps 200 years older than the Hatha Pradipika, requires that one perform nauli in order to create a vacuum in the stomach. And so we know that yogis must have been doing it for at least 200 years before. So we know that it wasn't suddenly dreamt up and then introduced with the Hatha Pradipika. Although we don't know of any prior textual sources. I expect there was a text, because that seems to be the nature of the Hatha Pradipika, that it's a compilation, but we don't know for sure. Also, there are 4 kumbhakas, 4 breathing techniques which are introduced, special breathing techniques which are introduced in the Hatha Pradipika. It also includes 4 of these kumbhakas from the earlier Goraksha Shataka. So the Goraksha Shataka, which I mentioned in the last session, is the first text to teach these complex methods of inhalation and or exhalation known as kumbhakas. The Hatha Pradipika is usually understood to be a text of the Nath tradition. I'm not so sure. It's introduced at the beginning. It has a list of siddhas, of great masters who, through the practice of Hatha Yoga, have conquered death. And it lists various siddhas of the Nath tradition, including Matsyendra, Goraksha. But at the end, or near the end, it also mentions Alama Prabhu, who's one of the main saints of a quite different tradition, that of the Veera Shaivas. And my suspicion is that, in fact, this text was composed in a Veera Shaiva milieu. This was, again, a Shaiva tradition, followers of Shiva, that flourished in southeast India from about the 12th or 13th century onwards. And we see in their iconography at sites such as Sri Shailam, rather wonderful tantric centre in Andhra Pradesh in southeast India. There, even though the temple iconography was patronised by Veerashaivas, we find lots of depictions of Naths. So the fact that they mention Naths doesn't mean that that it's necessarily a Nath tradition, because in their legends, even though they talk about the Naths quite a lot, at the end of them, the Veerashaiva saints always triumph over the Naths. So this is my current hunch. Now, as I mentioned in a previous session as well, the Hatha Pradipika kind of squashes the system of 4 yogas first introduced in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra into 2. So it gets rid of mantra yoga. It doesn't even squash that one, actually. It just gets rid of it completely, which is a kind of curious feature of the Hatha Pradipika, in that it doesn't mention mantras at all. And that seems to be in some way dissociating itself from the tantric traditions. Like I mentioned in the context of Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, mantra, the repetition of mantras to acquire magical powers or supernatural powers, however one wants to describe them, is a key element of the tantric traditions. And so in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra it's somewhat dismissed, but it's mentioned. Hatha Pradipika, no mention is even made of it. And I think we actually see something similar here in this notion of the Shakt Karmas, which I mentioned, these cleansing practices, because in earlier textual traditions, particularly, in the tantric traditions, the Shakt Karmas are 6 sort of malicious actions, one might say, that are brought about through mantra repetition. So it's ways of stunning or killing people, or acquiring things that aren't yours, and so forth. So my hunch is that by using this term for the cleansing practices in the Hatha Pradipika, the author is kind of dismissing at the same time the very well-known Shakt karmas of the tantric traditions. So it seems to be setting itself apart from those tantric traditions. Now, so it gets rid of mantra yoga. It certainly doesn't mention Laya yoga as a method of yoga. It does mention Laya in a few places, but it sort of subsumes that under the goal of yoga practice more generally. And so effectively it only teaches Hatha yoga and Raja yoga. Raja yoga is the goal. It's equated with samadhi. In fact, a long list of synonyms of Raja yoga is given, and it's almost like a sort of inventory of the texts that are used in the compilation of the Hatha Pradipika, because these various different words for samadhi are often how the goal is named, the goal of various other yoga texts are named. So we get things like amanaska, a state of no mind, or mukti, liberation, samadhi, absorption. These are all, or shunya as well, which is a term that has Buddhist connotations, but again here may have something to do with these Virashaiva traditions. And they're all equated with Raja yoga, so they're all equated with the goal of yoga. But equally it's said that you can't have Raja yoga without Hatha yoga, and you can't have Hatha yoga without Raja yoga. So that's a sort of brief summary of the Hatha Pradipika. As I said, it's then, it's the text most referred to by subsequent commentators and scholars. But the discovery that it was a compilation, and then the efforts by me and as a scholar called Christian Bouy, a Frenchman who published a monograph in the early 90s, in which he was the first person to really sort of lay out in which ways the Hatha Pradipika is a compilation, and building on his work I've identified a few other texts. But it's thanks to that then we're able to identify these earlier texts. And interestingly enough as well, we don't know of any texts that predate the Hatha Pradipika and teach Hatha Yoga that were not used in its compilation. So it seems to have been really quite comprehensive. Swatmarama had a good library and drew on just about everything. Or as far as we're aware, he drew on everything that he could in order to make this compilation. So as a result, the Hatha Pradipika enables us to sort of identify a corpus of Hatha Yoga texts. And then when we look at these individual texts that were used in its compilation, some of them, not all, provide very coherent teachings, which are rather easier to understand. So, for example, the Amrita Siddhi, which I mentioned in the previous session, which is the first text to teach any of the Hatha Yoga practices, provides a really quite detailed and coherent explanation of yogic physiology and how the techniques of Hatha Yoga work. Then as the things get combined more and more, it all gets a bit more complicated and a bit harder to understand. So, the Hatha Pradipika is useful as a sort of encyclopedia, but it's not perhaps the most coherent teaching, in that the Swatmarama tries to include a little bit of everything, which can get a little bit confusing. Okay, so that takes us up to the Hatha Yoga taught in the Hatha Pradipika I kind of term classical Hatha Yoga. Everything that went before it was early Hatha Yoga. Now, in the remainder of this session, we'll look a bit at subsequent texts that appeared, and what we see over the subsequent centuries is Hatha Yoga becoming a much more mainstream. Prior to this time, it seems to have been the preserve of some relatively esoteric sects, or at least the more esoteric wings of orthodox sects. It doesn't seem to have been particularly well patronized. It seems to have been somewhat distinct from orthodox kind of Brahmanical Sanskritic traditions. But then this situation slowly changes, and it culminates in the 17th or 18th century in the compilation of a dozen or so texts which have come to be known as the Yoga Upanishads. They're all Upanishads. They have various different names. Yoga Kundali Upanishad, Yoga Tattva Upanishad, Darshana Upanishad, and so forth. And so people often make the mistake of assuming that any text called Upanishad must be, at least 2,000 years old. That's not true. I think Upanishads are still being composed. I think Upanishads were composed at least in the last century, and the way these were put together has been outlined in a book by Christian Bouy, which I mentioned earlier, called Les Natha Yoga et les Upanishads. And in the 18th century, a Brahmin scholar called Upanishad Brahma Yogin, at least that was the title he was given after he completed his magnum opus, which was a commentary on the 108 Upanishads. So then he was given this, this title, which means the yogi of Brahma of the Upanishads. But when he undertook this task, there wasn't a kind of homogeneous, complete corpus of 108 Upanishads on which to comment. So this is when he compiled various extra Upanishads to make the number up to 108, including these Yoga Upanishads. Some of them are brand new. Others are kind of revisions of earlier Upanishads, probably dating to the 11th or 12th century. But in order to do this, what he did was he took large chunks, in some cases entire, all of earlier texts on Hatha Yoga. So just about all the texts I've mentioned were used in some way or other to produce these Yoga Upanishads. So the Yoga Kundali Upanishad, for example, its second chapter, I think it is the first chapter of the Khetri Vidya. The Yoga Tattva Upanishad corresponds almost entirely to the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra. So that's really, we see that as a sort of the final triumph of Hatha Yoga, where it really becomes accepted by the mainstream. To be in an Upanishad shows proper orthodox acceptance. Prior to that, we find texts such as the Yoga Chintamani of Shivananda Saraswati from the 16th or perhaps early 17th century, which again is an analysis of yoga by a Brahmanical scholar. It's what might be classified as a nibandha. It's a sort of compilation of quotations from various different texts, and in that analysis, he includes several long citations, quotations from Hatha texts, and analyzes them accordingly. And then we find more kind of creative works, works that seem to be reaching towards the practice traditions. They're not just looking backwards to the texts that have already been compiled, like Shivananda did, but we have a text called the Hatha Ratnavali of Srinivasa, probably 17th century, and that's the first text to list 84 asanas. It only describes, if I remember rightly, I think about 32 of them, but it gives the names of 84. And he includes descriptions of lots of other practice, goes into great detail about all the mudras, the cleansing techniques and so forth, and he's quite an entertaining author. He's pretty snooty towards Swatmarama, the compiler or composer of the Hatha Pradipaka. Says he's completely wrong, and says he can't actually be bothered even to list and refute all the mistakes he's made, because that would be like pointlessly climbing a mountain, and he just points out a few mistakes of his, and he actually includes a few teachings on a few techniques that Swatmarama omits. Then in the 18th century, there's a Brahmin scholar called Sundaradeva, a work of his called the Hatha Tattva Kaumadi has been published, and then I and my project team have been working on a manuscript, or a couple of manuscripts, of a rather longer work called the Hatha Sanketa Chandrika, also by Sundaradeva, which seems to be perhaps the same text but expanded, and that includes all kinds of interesting teachings. In particular, we've recently been looking at its teachings on techniques called charanas, which are kind of quite aerobic exercises, which are taught in the context of pranayama, breath control, and they're said to assist in the process of purifying the nadis, purifying the channels inside the body of the yogi. And they involve, quite aerobic, repetitive exercises of rotating the hips, rotating the arms, and so forth. But they're not taught as asanas. Interesting enough, they're not included in the asana section, even though that is quite extensive. There are also some vernacular texts, so texts not in Sanskrit, and these are very interesting as well. There's one from probably the 18th century. It's meant to have been written in around 1730, 1735, called the Jog Pradipika, and that is written by a scholar called Jaitarama, perhaps a yogi as well himself, and he's of the Ramanandi tradition. And it's called the Jog Pradipika, so that's which means a light on yoga. Now, curiously, it doesn't really use the word hatha for some reason, even though the techniques it's teaching are based on those of the Hatha Pradipika, but much expanded. So again, it teaches 84 asanas, it gives full descriptions of all of them. It teaches, I think, 25 mudras, lots of techniques of breath control and so forth, but it frames them all within not within the Shaiva framework of texts such as the Hatha Pradipika or Shiva Samhita and so forth, but within a Ramanandi, so a Vaishnava, a Vaishnava perspective. A Vaishnava is a follower of Vishnu, and the Ramanandis are followers, in particular, of the Rama incarnation of Vishnu. So where normally we would find praise of Shiva and Parvati, his wife, we find praise of Rama and Sita. This is also it's a very interesting text in itself, written in rather lovely Braj Bhasha, so a medieval form of Hindi or a pre-modern form of Hindi. But also in the British Library, there's a beautiful illustrated manuscript of this text, probably dating to, around 1800. And it has an interesting story about it as well, in that it was taken by a British officer when the British, during the mutiny or the uprising, however one wants to describe it, in 1857 in India, they stormed the fort of the Rani of Jhansi, so the Queen of Jhansi, who's a famous kind of, to this day celebrated as an Indian freedom fighter, but she'd had to run away in the end. Legend has it she jumped off the ramparts of the fort on her horse and rode away, although I've looked over those ramparts, sounds rather unlikely. Anyway, the British officer, among the spoils that were taken from Jhansi at this time, was this manuscript of the Jog Pradipika, and it's fully illustrated, so every asana is illustrated, every mudra and so forth. These are rather beautiful illustrations. Now, if we go back to the first session, when I was talking about the kind of forerunners, the antecedents of Hatha Yoga practice, and how they seem to be tied up with ascetic methods, we find in the asanas of the Jog Pradipika, and beautifully illustrated in this manuscript, one of the asanas is called the Tapkar asana, which means the asana of the person who does tapas, who does austerity, and that is illustrated by an ascetic hanging upside down from a tree. So this is this bat penance that I mentioned, which is mentioned by the Buddha in the Pali Canon, and here it is resurfacing, nearly 2,500 years later, but as an asana. There it's clearly a method of tapasya, but it's now included amongst the 84 asanas. Similarly, we find the Mahamudra asana, which was first taught in the Mahamudras, first taught in the Amrita Siddhi as one of these mudras of Hatha Yoga, but it then appears in this list of 84 asanas, illustrated list, as one of the asanas. So this period from the sort of 17th, 18th century onwards, we see a great increase in the number of yoga texts. As I mentioned, vernacular texts, not just this Jog Pradipika. There's texts produced in the Dadu Panthi tradition, another kind of Vaishnava ascetic tradition. We find illustrated manuscripts there. And I'm sure there are lots more. So just recently a friend sent me photographs from a manuscript repository in Rajasthan, a place called Alwar, of a beautiful manuscript with illustrated yoga techniques. Some of them very curious ones I'd never seen before. One of them, someone was hanging upside down, not upside down from a tree, but with a rope from a tree around their waist, and the yogis sort of suspended parallel to the ground. And there's text that goes with that, both Sanskrit and Hindi, so I'm trying to get hold of that manuscript. There are lots more in catalogues and so forth. There's this great sort of proliferation. Yoga, really goes mainstream during that period, and in an associated fashion, the descriptions of practice get much more diverse. There are many more asanas taught. There are some texts, 110, 120 asanas we find being taught. There's a general proliferation in the number of practices. Although what I will note is that, contrary to sort of general tendency one would expect of things becoming more prolix, more diverse, better explained as time goes on, in fact, the Amrita Siddhi still provides the best description of the workings of the yogic body, and this seems to be forgotten in subsequent texts. So this is what's been very exciting working on that text, which hasn't been published in any form, and within the next 2 or 3 years we'll be bringing out a critical edition and translation. So that should have some treats in store for everyone. Now, yes, I suspect there are many, many more texts from this later period, the 17th to 19th century. One very interesting one that we've been working on in my project is called the Hatha Paddhati, and it's attributed to a sage called Kapala Karuntaka, or a yogi called Kapala Karuntaka. And that is very closely related to another text called the Sri Tattva Nidhi, which was written supposedly by the Maharaja of Mysore, I think in the early 19th century. And that's a huge voluminous text on all kinds of things, but it does have a yoga section in some of its recensions, and it teaches 100 or so asanas. The Hatha Paddhati is a slightly more coherent, at least it's the order in which the asanas are taught is more coherent, and seems to be the source, or at least closer to the source, of the Sri Tattva Nidhi. And this is a manuscript that my colleague Jason Birch obtained from a library in Maharashtra in central India, and we've been looking closely at that. And it teaches 120 asanas. Some of them include repeated kind of physical movements. They're dynamic, because this is a major revolution, really, because the word asana itself comes from the root which means not only to sit but also to stay, to remain in the same position. So really we're seeing a kind of modern, a new interpretation of the practice. To use the word asana for a technique that involves movement is definitely a kind of a big jump. We find quite a lot of that. We find postures that involve ropes or leaning against walls and so forth. And this and also we think, we're not certain, but it seems very likely that some of the sequences of postures taught in that text are sequences. You're meant to go through a sequence of postures. Because prior, in the early teachings on Hatha Yoga, well, up to the Hatha Pradipika, all the texts which said they were teaching Hatha, none of them taught complex postures. They only taught simple seated postures for meditation. And even when the complex postures come in, the texts generally say, just find one posture that you're suited to and stick to that. There's no notion of having to go through sequences of postures or different postures or anything like that. So this seems to be an important innovation of this Hatha Paddhati text. And it's also of interest for modern yoga in that the Sri Tattva Nidhi, which is closely connected with it but seems to be a kind of descended from it, because, as I said, the order in which the asanas are presented in that text is less coherent, doesn't make as much sense as the Hatha Paddhati one. That was based in the Mysore Palace and was a text from which Krishnamacharya, the great guru of modern yoga practice, who was based in Mysore in the first half of the 20th century. Well, subsequently, but that's when he did his sort of first great period of teaching. He appears to have drawn some of his teachings from the Sri Tattva-nidhi. He mentions it in his writings. But not only that, the Hatha-abhyasa Paddhati is ascribed to a sage called Kapala Kuruntaka. Kurunta is mentioned as one of the yogis who have defeated death in the Hatha Pradipika, so in a text much earlier, 300 or 400 years earlier. So he may just be some legendary sage, but Krishnamacharya has also said that he got his teachings, or some of his teachings, from a text called the Yoga Kurunta. So this again seems to indicate a strong connection with the Hatha-abhyasa Paddhati. Although it's not clear that he necessarily knew that text, there just seems to be some kind of continuity of the teachings found in it. So the Hatha-abhyasa Paddhati and the Sri Tattva-nidhi are, amongst the latest of the Hatha Yoga texts that we know of. And we're working on the manuscript of the Hatha-abhyasa Paddhati as part of my research project. We're also working on the Amrita Siddhi. So those are the kind of the first and the last, the alpha and the omega of the Hatha corpus. And as I've mentioned here, there were many texts in between, and we do see a kind of fairly steady process of development. We see more and more emphasis on asana, and I'll talk a bit more about asana practice in the next section. In fact, in the next session, I'm going to talk about all the different techniques of Hatha. And we see this over the 16th to 18th, 19th centuries. We see Hatha becoming less of a kind of obscure method of yoga practiced by these sort of fairly left field ascetics to becoming really mainstream. Yoga itself becomes orthodox through having these yoga Upanishads written, and key to the methods of that yoga are the methods of Hatha Yoga. Similarly, at the same time, we see an increased interest in Hatha Yoga from scholars of Vedanta and practitioners of Vedanta as well, who are trying to integrate yoga into their practice. And we see that. So Shivananda Saraswati, whom I mentioned earlier as the author of the Yoga Chintamani, he comes from a Dvaita Vedanta tradition. We see a significant proliferation in the number of techniques, whether that's some sort of competitive extension. One text appears and says, I've got 20 mudras, and another one comes out and says, I've got 30 mudras, but we're not sure. There's a text I didn't mention earlier, actually, the Gheranda Samhita, which I should have mentioned. I've translated, it's been published. That, again, is a relatively late 18th century text, and that's illustrative of this proliferation in the techniques of Hatha Yoga. So, the earlier texts up to the Hatha Pradipika teach 10 mudras. The Gheranda Samhita teaches 25. Although, again, it's sort of playing around with terms, the Gheranda Samhita, in that it includes in those 25 mudras 5 techniques which in earlier Hatha texts are called dharanas. So they're mental fixations on the 5 elements. So perhaps, that would be indicative of this competitive extension where they're trying to say, look, we've got 25 mudras, but they couldn't think of 25, so they drew from the dharanas to make up a bigger number. And at the same time, again, the mechanics of the practices seem to be less well understood in these later texts. So one might argue that it's a sort of more superficial treatment of the practices of Hatha Yoga. They want to teach more and more asanas and so forth, but they're not concentrating so much on their effect on the yogic body, on what they're doing within the channels and so forth within the body. So perhaps that might be a forerunner, leading into some aspects of modern yoga practice in which emphasis on cultivation of the body through asana becomes more prominent. We do find that within the Hatha Yoga texts as well. Okay, so in the next session, and I've given you a background to the textual sources and also the forerunners of Hatha Yoga, we'll look at the practices themselves. So starting with the Hatha Yogic mudras and then the breath control techniques and then asana.
Wise Studies presents The History and Practices of Traditional Hatha Yoga with Dr. James Mallinson. Session 4. In this session, Jim discusses the various practices of Hatha Yoga.
Hello and welcome to the fourth session of this introduction to Hatha Yoga. The first three sessions dealt with the prehistory, the early practices and forerunners of Hatha Yoga, and the texts which teach it. In this session, I'm going to discuss the actual techniques of Hatha Yoga, how it's practiced and why it was practiced. So I'm going to focus on Hatha Yoga as taught in the Hatha Pradipika, a text I discussed in the last session, which was composed probably around 1450 CE, and is a synthesis of all the teachings on Hatha Yoga that preceded it. I call its techniques classical Hatha Yoga, because the Hatha Yoga that was formalized in the Hatha Pradipika then seems to become the basis for most subsequent discussions, whether the authors agree with it or not. Some don't, some do. But the structure and contents of the practices of Hatha Yoga as taught in it are found replicated, sometimes expanded, but are found in pretty much every subsequent text. And so the distinctive features of Hatha Yoga as taught in the Hatha Pradipika are the practice of asana, but that's not asana or posture as it's translated, or a seat. I mean, asana is a word that originally in Sanskrit means a throne or a seat, something that you sit upon. Then it becomes a seated posture, and in texts prior to those of Hatha Yoga, it means a seated posture for meditation. But in Hatha Yoga, asana acquires this new additional meaning of more complex positions, bodily positions. So that's one of the distinctive features. The second is kumbhaka, or kumbhaka literally means breath retention, but associated with it are 8 specific methods of inhalation and exhalation, and those two are unique to and distinctive of Hatha Yoga. And the third technique flagged up in the Hatha Pradipika in a particular verse, which sort of says these are the parts, the angas of Hatha practice, is mudra. So these are physical methods of controlling the vital energies. The Hatha Pradipika also mentions as a specific anga of Hatha practice nadanusandhana, which is the process of listening to the internal sounds. And I'll say a little bit about that, but that's not really distinctive, in fact, to Hatha practice. It's fairly common in earlier tantric techniques. And not mentioned as distinctive of Hatha, but which really is, are also the shakt karmas, the 6 cleansing techniques. So I'll say a little bit about those too. In fact, they'll come in fairly early on, as they're preliminary methods. So before the yogi undertakes his or her practice, there are various preliminary observances that need to be undertaken. Many texts describe where the yogi should practice, and that's normally said to be a small hut or a matika, which literally means a sort of small monastery. So it's kind of like a cell, I suppose, a monastic cell, fairly small dimensions, generally said to, should be free of insects and other irritations, no holes in the walls, enough room to practice asana and so forth. And then the text usually also say a little bit about the diet that should be observed by the yogi. The key factor of that, the key aspect of that is mitahara. So ahara, food, which is mita, which is restricted or limited, i.e., don't overeat. All the texts also say, or some of them say, that once the yogi is perfected and mastered Hatha Yoga, it doesn't actually matter how much he or she eats. You can get away with eating nothing for a long time, or eat huge quantities and not really notice, not be affected. But that's only for the perfected yogi. When training, it should be you should eat small, limited amounts of vegetarian food, mildly flavoured, not too spicy, well oiled. Plenty of ghee. Ghee is always seen to be good for hatha practice, and it should be nourishing and tasty. And as I said, eaten in small quantities is the key feature of the hatha yogi's diet. So those are the basics, and then preliminary practices. Well, of course, in Patanjali, we find in Patanjali's eightfold yoga, the first two auxiliaries or angas are yama and niyama, these observances. Now, those aren't generally listed in Hatha texts, but I don't think that means we can ignore them. I think they're just taken for granted. So in the Hatha Pradipika, for example, nowhere does the author list the yamas and niyamas, but they are mentioned at one point in passing. I think ahimsa is meant to be the best of them. So that doesn't mean that ethical and moral observances can be left behind, as some people occasionally infer. So yes, one needs to be a good person as well. It's also often said in these texts that one needs to live in a good country, a well-governed country. It's no use trying to practice yoga when there's riots going on and you like to be robbed and so forth. So that's another factor to be taken into consideration. Okay, and then the actual practices themselves. Well, as I mentioned, there are these six, they're always said to be the six cleansing techniques, and I discussed this in the earlier session. The Sanskrit for that is shat karma, which means six techniques, but often, so in the Hatha Pradipika, 7 are taught. In the Hatha Ratnavali, 8 are taught. And that, again, I think is an argument for why the author of the Hatha Pradipika, in using this term, is actually just trying to trump tantric magical techniques, which can also be called the shat karma, and these are techniques in which one uses mantras and yantras and so forth in order to overcome one's enemies and achieve various kind of nefarious magical ends. So the shat karma, the 6 or 7 or 8 cleansing techniques, as taught in the Hatha text, or in particular as taught in the Hatha Pradipika, consist of firstly dhauti, which literally means just sort of cleansing, and this involves swallowing a long, thin piece of well-washed, moistened cotton cloth, and crucially one must hold on to the other end so that it doesn't get swallowed completely. It goes into the stomach, and then you can churn the stomach, perhaps. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And then you slowly extract it, and that's to clean the stomach, the intestines, and also the gullet and so forth, the throat. So that's dhauti. All these techniques, by the way, are expanded on in great detail, and various variations are given and so forth in a text called the Gheranda Samhita, which is rather later, probably 18th century. So that's the place to look for if you want to get the full detail on all the possible variations of these techniques. I'm just giving you a basic summary here. The second of the shat karma is basti. Now, basti literally means bladder, or a bladder. But here, in the context of yoga, and also in Ayurveda, but there's a distinction which I'll come on to, it means an enema. Okay, so the yogic method involves squatting in water. The water needs to come up to the navel, and it clearly needs to, your backside needs to be underwater. And then you create a vacuum in the stomach using nauli again, which I will discuss in a minute. And that will, the vacuum created in the stomach, the lowering of the air pressure there then means that water will enter the rectum and then the intestines through the anus. When it's first being practiced, one needs a pipe of some sort to hold the anus open. Traditionally, yogis use a piece of bamboo, which they've sort of polished somewhat, as one can imagine. It needs to have rounded edges. But then once that's, after a while, once it's perfected, then the use of a pipe is unnecessary. The Gheranda Samhita goes into other types of bhasti, including doing it with air and so forth. Now, yes, a point here is that Ayurvedic texts also teach bhasti, but in a different form. The crucial difference between the cleansing methods as found in Hatha Yoga texts and those in Ayurveda is that those of Hatha Yoga can be performed by the yogi on his or her own. The yogi is an autonomous person, whereas Ayurveda is a medicinal science in which the medicine is administered by a doctor, known as a Vaidya. So this seems to be a key difference between Ayurveda and yoga. I've looked for the cleansing techniques of Hatha Yoga within Ayurvedic texts, and they're not to be found. The third method of the Shat Karma is Neti. It's called Neti. There are two forms of this, Sutra Neti and Jala Neti. So Sutra Neti is when Sutra means a thread, so a thread or filament of some sort is passed through a nostril, and then as it goes down the back of the throat, you have to pick it out with your fingers and then pull it out of your mouth, and then you sort of churn it back and forth, and that cleans the sinuses, the nasal passages, and the throat to some extent. And then Jala Neti is the same but performed with water, so one draws water in through the nose and expels it through the mouth. The fourth of the Shat Karma is Tratak, or Trataka in Sanskrit, and that involves simply staring at an object until tears flow forth. It can be a candle, it can be anything, and that's said to cleanse the eyes. The fifth of the Shat Karmas is Nauli, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. It can be understood as sort of abdominal churning. When learning, it's done standing up, slightly with the knees slightly bent, hands on the thighs, and then all the air is expelled from the chest, the abdomen's drawn up, and then one needs to learn to isolate the muscles to the side of the central channel of the stomach, and then one can make it stand forward. And then once that's done, you learn to churn it, to make it roll from side to side. And as mentioned before, it's this Nauli method that is used to perform bhasti. So that's the Hatha Yogic enema, because by making the central channel of the stomach stand forward like that, it creates a vacuum internally, and that will force water to enter through the rectum if one's squatting underwater. It's also used in Vajroli Mudra, which I'll talk a bit more about later on, but it's a similar-ish technique in which liquids are drawn up through the urethra, through the penis. And we know, so we can infer from the fact that the Vajroli Mudra is taught in the circa 13th century Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, which is a couple of centuries older than the Hatha Pradipika. We can infer from that Nauli was being practiced. So just to reiterate the fact that even though we see a temporal development in the practices of Hatha Yoga within the text, just because something appears for the first time in a text doesn't mean it's being practiced for the first time. The sixth technique of the Shat Karmas is Kapala Bhati, which literally means shining Bhati of the skull, Kapala. And this is actually a breathing technique, but its primary purpose is cleansing of the channels of the body, and that's when one breathes in forcefully, in and out forcefully through the nose like a pair of bellows. Quite similar to the Bhastrika Pranayama or Bhastrika Kumbhaka method of breath retention, which I'll come on to. Now, as I said, even though these techniques are grouped under the heading of the Shat Karmas, the six techniques, six methods, In the Hatha Pradipika, 7 are given, and the 7th is called Gajakarani, which literally means the elephant procedure, and that involves drinking large amounts of water and then regurgitating it. So it's another method of cleansing the stomach. And then the Hatha Ratnavali, which I discussed in the previous session, whose author Srinivasa makes some quite disparaging remarks about Swatmarama, the author of the Hatha Pradipika, and he says that Swatmarama is clearly ignorant because he doesn't include Chakri, which is an 8th method of cleansing that Srinivasa does teach in the Hatha Ratnavali, and that involves cleansing the anus with a finger. And in fact, that's still well practiced by yogis, when they go to the loo in the morning, traditional ascetic yogis in India, but they call it the Ganesh Kriya. And that's sort of tied in with the practice of bhasti. That helps achieve mastery of bhasti, the yogic enema. The purpose of the Shat Karmas, the cleansing techniques, as taught in the Hatha Pradipika, is to eliminate imbalances of the 3 doshas, as taught in Ayurveda. So these are kapha, pitta, and vata. They correspond in some ways, although not directly to the humours as taught in early Western medicine. So kapha, to some extent, is phlegm, vata, air, and pitta, bile, but that's the sort of fiery element in the body. So the text says quite clearly that if they're all in balance, if you're healthy, you don't need to do any of those shat karmas, you don't need to do any of those cleansings. And then once your doshas are balanced, once your body is in harmony, you can then practice pranayama, simple breath control. Okay, I'll come on to the more complex ones later on, but the simple form of pranayama or breath control is also seen as a purificatory method. In fact, it builds on a much older heritage, going right back sort of 2,000 years to the early Vedic texts, in which breath control is seen as a purificatory and expiatory technique. So it kind of is seen to burn up impurities and also burn up sin or bad deeds, the results of which have been accumulated. They are burnt up by practicing breath control. So after performing the cleansing techniques, a simple breath control is enjoined, and that basically just consists of inhaling through one nostril, usually start with the left, then holding the breath, exhaling through the right nostril, then inhaling again through the right nostril, holding the breath, and exhaling through the left. And you repeat that various numbers of times. Different numbers of times are given within the text, and also different ratios of how long, of the length of the inhalation, retention, and exhalation. It's usually 1, 4, 2. So say you inhale for 8 counts, and the counts can be, often the counts, a matra or a measure in some texts is said to be the time it takes to circle your hand around your knee and snap your fingers. And yes, a regular, a common measure of duration for these breath controls is 8 matras of inhalation, then 32 of holding the breath, and then 16 of exhalation. And this should be done, it's usually said 3 times a day at three junctures of the day, so morning, at dawn, the middle of the day, and at dusk. And that is a method of purification of the nadis, the channels inside the body. Now, the next technique, I'm going to now turn to asana, posture, and then I'll return to the more complex kumbhakas, the more complex breathing methods, as that's the order in which they're taught within the texts. Asana, until the Hatha texts, or until some less known Vaishnava tantric texts, which just predate the Hatha corpus, but they're the texts in which we first find non-seated postures included as part of the asanas of yoga, and the very first is Mayurasana, the peacock, and then we get Kukutasana. This in 2 texts called the Vimanarchana Kalpa and the Ahirbudnya Samhita. So they're from a Vaishnava, so that's followers of Vishnu, a tantric tradition associated with them from probably the 10th, 11th, 12th century. And we then see the descriptions of those practices change slightly in a couple of other Vaishnava texts, and then they appear in the Hatha Pradipika. The Hatha Pradipika teaches 15 asanas or postures. 8 of them are seated postures, relatively simple seated postures for meditation. And as I mentioned, until the Hatha corpus, the asanas of yoga are pretty much, they all are seated postures for meditation and for breath control. It's said that in some earlier texts, particularly in tantric texts, that extended breath retention and meditative techniques may cause kind of trembling or jerking of the body, and so it's important to have a well-locked, stable asana whilst one's meditating or practicing such techniques. And then actually, even in the earliest Hatha texts, so such as the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, the Vivekamartanda, and as an aside, the Amrita Siddhi says nothing about asana at all. In fact, when it uses the word asana, it means a seat, not a way of sitting. That's the Amrita Siddhi is the earliest Hatha text. But in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra and Vivekamartanda, it's said that there are as many asanas, as many postures as there are living beings, and the number given is 84 lakh. So that's a lakh, or a laksha in Sanskrit, is 100,000. So that's 8,400,000. Of those, Shiva has apparently taught 84, according to the Vivekamartanda. And then of those, only 2 are important, or 2 are primary. And they are the lotus position, Padmasana, and the Siddhasana, so the posture of the adepts. And that's the posture in which usually the left heel is put at the perineum, in men underneath the testicles, and the right foot is put on top of the penis. So pressure is lightly applied to the perineum, and that again is a meditative posture. And it's often said in these texts that you should just find the one posture that suits you and stick to that, the one in which you're comfortable for practicing your meditation. So still in the early parts of the corpus, there isn't any major emphasis on complex meditational postures, or complex postures of any sort. And it's not until the Hatha Pradipika of the Hatha text that we find non-seated postures included under the rubric of asana in a Hatha text. And there are 7 mentioned. So there's the Mayorasana, the peacock pose, Kukutasana, the cock, and then there's 5 others, including, as I mentioned in the previous session, the corpse pose, Shavasana. And here, the verse describing the corpse pose is taken from the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, in which it's taught as a method of Laya Yoga. It's not taught as an asana at all. So this is we see with the Hatha Pradipika, the first part of this process in which various physical techniques come to be subsumed under the rubric of asana. And obviously that's something which continues throughout the history of Hatha Yoga, right up to the present day, where we see in the development of yoga over the 20th century other physical postures and techniques being incorporated within Hatha Yoga, some drawn from non-Indian sources, and they're all described as asanas. Now this is quite a semantic development as well, since asana comes from the root as, which means to sit or to remain in one position. So the kind of dynamic non-seated asanas that we see as part of yoga are a long way from asana's early formulations. But that's not to say that we don't find anything like that in pre-modern treatments of yoga in India. We do. I've just been looking at a manuscript of a text called the Hatha Sanketa Chandrika, written in the 18th century by a Brahmin called Sundaradeva, and he teaches various, they're called charanas, so they're not actually directly identified with asanas, but they're dynamic movements of the body, which are also seen as purifying the channels. You rotate 10 different parts of the body, the legs, the head, the hips, and so forth. And at the same time, you are instructed to meditate on dancing Shiva. So we do see dynamic movements as part of yoga, particularly in the latter half of the second millennium CE. And in a text called the Hatha Abhyasa Paddhati, which is probably 18th, perhaps early 19th century, we find under the name asana also various dynamic movements. So there does seem to be some, there's clearly a development in the tradition of asana within India before any contact with more globalized techniques of physical culture. And in fact, asana's usage, the word asana, seems to start changing, around about 1,000 years ago, because we then start seeing in texts on erotics, for example, the positions for lovemaking referred to as asanas. And also the same period, there's a text which teaches different positions for fighting elephants, and they're also referred to as asanas. So there's something happens with the semantic range of the term fairly early on in India. Yes, and we see over the period from the 16th to 18th century, so after the Hatha Pradipika, a massive proliferation in descriptions of asanas. We find in the Hatha Ratnavali, which is probably around 1600, it's the first text which actually lists 84 asanas. As I said, in the earliest text of Hatha Yoga, it said that there are 8,400,000, and then Shiva has taught 84, but these don't actually get mentioned until this circa 1600 text, the Hatha Ratnavali. We don't find depictions, though, of the 84 asanas until probably the early 19th century. The earliest are on the walls, they're murals on the walls of a temple called the Mahamandir in Jodhpur. And in fact, those murals depict 84 Nath yogis, so yogis associated with the Nath tradition, also known as Siddhas. And in that tradition, by this period, it seems that the 84 postures were also associated with an old tradition of 84 siddhas, 84 great adepts, which we also find in tantric Buddhist traditions. But when we see those 84 siddhas first depicted around about the 14th century in India, we have older depictions from Tibet, they're all just sitting in regular meditative postures. So this kind of confluence of the 84 adepts and 84 different postures again takes some time to develop. So we see a clear trajectory in which the notion of complex asanas proliferates over the course of the second millennium CE. As I discussed in the first session, there's evidence of Indian ascetics, Indian holy men, performing difficult postures from at least 2,500 years ago. But it seems that in the early period, the purpose of such postures was tapas, was asceticism, self-mortification, almost disregard for the body, to disable the body in some ways. These stories of yogis holding their arms up until they wither and so forth. But what we see within the Hatha corpus, and I'll talk a bit more about this in the next session, is a notion of cultivating the body, which sort of stands somewhat at odds with this extreme ascetic practice. And at the same time, we find these different types of postures coming into Hatha Yoga. And it's said in the Hatha Pradipika that the purpose of asana is steadiness of the body, to make the body sort of steady, firm, good health, and also suppleness of the body. Now, this is the first time such an aim is articulated for asana practice. Previously, as I've mentioned, asana is just associated with a firm, solid seat for meditation. So what we're seeing here is a kind of translation of yoga practice from something for ascetic practitioners who may have a great disregard for the body, to something in which the body is valorized and is seen as something to be cultivated and looked after. So that's asana as practiced in the Hatha traditions. Another key development, a distinctive feature of Hatha Yoga practice, are the kumbhakas. Now, kumbhaka literally means sort of a pot. A kumbha is a pot, and the idea is that the abdomen of the yogi is like a pot that is filled up with air. And the kumbhakas are often taught together with pranayama, the simple pranayama that I taught earlier, but they seem to have a more specific purposes than pranayama, which is just a general kind of preliminary purificatory technique. And in fact, some of the kumbhakas have soteriological ends. By that I mean ends that aim directly at liberation or enlightenment. So they're more kind of esoteric than the simple breath control method that I described earlier. Now, these kumbhakas are first taught in a text called the Goraksha Shataka, which I described in a previous session, which is probably composed around the 13th century, and there's 4 of them taught there. And one curious feature about them is that even though they're all subsumed under the heading kumbhaka, which is a neuter noun, I think it is. It's certainly not feminine. They all have feminine names, and this makes me suspect that perhaps they've come from an earlier tradition, that they've been taught in some earlier, possibly tantric text, and then found their way into the Hatha Yoga traditions, but that's just a guess. They certainly first appear only in the texts of Hatha Yoga. Now, the first one is the Surya Kumbhaka, in which the yogi inhales through the solar channel. Surya means sun, so the yogi inhales through the solar or right nostril, and this is seen as a heating technique. So in some subsequent texts, it's actually taught that you should use this, if you're cold, then you should practice Surya Kumbhaka by inhaling through the right nostril or the solar channel, and then holding the breath, and then exhaling through the left channel. You will heat the body up. The second technique is called Ujjayi, which literally means sort of victorious. And in that one, you inhale through both nostrils, and whilst doing that, you make a rasping sound as the breath sort of strikes or scrapes across the palate, one might say. And then you hold the breath, and then you exhale through the left nostril. The third one is called Shitali, and Shitala is a Sanskrit word meaning cool. In this one, you inhale through the rolled tongue, then you hold the breath, and then you exhale through both nostrils. And this is sort of the opposite of Surya, in that it's said to cool down the body. Yogis, if they're getting too hot, are instructed to use the Shitali Kumbhaka. And the fourth of the first group, so the fourth of the kumbhakas that are taught in the Goraksha Shataka, is Bhastri, and it's also called in later texts Bhastrika. This is a word for a bellows, and it's quite similar to the Shatkarma technique of Kapala Bhati, which I mentioned earlier. So in Bhastri, you breathe in and out repeatedly and rapidly through both nostrils, before slowly inhaling through the right nostril, holding the breath, and exhaling through the left nostril. So those are the 4 techniques taught in the Goraksha Shataka, and in fact their aims are perhaps relatively mundane. They bring about physical benefits, and to some extent they might overlap with the Shatkarmas in that they can balance out imbalances in the body. The Hatha Pradipika then adds 4 more kumbhakas, and I'm not sure where the Swatmarama, the author of the text, got them from, but they have rather more subtle aims and benefits. And the first of those is Sitkari, and a Sit in Sanskrit is a sort of onomatopoeic word for a kind of whistling sound. And so Sitkari involves making a whistling sound while inhaling through the mouth and then exhaling through the nostrils. And it's said that by performing this technique, the yogi becomes like a second god of love. And just as an aside, this is a feature we do find in Hatha texts, is that certain mastery of certain practices will make the yogi extremely attractive. But that, of course, is then a problem because members of the opposite sex will throw themselves at them, and that will detract from the practice. So, the point of that is that people might think that the modern emphasis of yoga on bringing about a beautiful body has no precedence, but that's not entirely true. The second of the second group of 4 is the Brahmari Kumbhaka. Now, a Brahmara is a bee, and so the Brahmari Kumbhaka involves making a buzzing sound like a bee while inhaling and exhaling, and it's said to bring about ananda, a feeling of bliss. And the third of the second group of four is murcha, which literally means fainting, passing out. And at the end of inhaling, the yogi is told to apply Jalandhara Bandha, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute, which is the chin lock. So you put the chin on the chest, and then breathe out very slowly, bringing him or herself to the point of fainting. And I suppose this is associated with the notion that found particularly in Hatha texts and earlier yoga texts, that samadhi, the highest sort of state of yoga, is really a state of kind of unconsciousness almost. And then the last of these 8 kumbhakas is called plavani, in which the abdomen is filled up with air and the yogi floats on water. This is the meaning of plavana, means to float or to flood, but it can mean to float as well. So yes, these are a curious bunch of techniques, and I'm not sure about their origins, but they appear for the first time within the Hatha corpus. We have no suggestion of them in any earlier texts. In some texts, the kumbhakas are classified into 2 sorts. So the ones I've just described are called sahita, accompanied kumbhakas. So the notion is that they are accompanied with specific methods of inhalation and or exhalation. Superior to them is the kevala kumbhaka. Now that means kevala means alone, isolated, unaccompanied. So there's no specific inhalation or exhalation. And in fact, it's the way it's understood, the way it's taught, is that the yogi can just stop breathing whenever he wants and hold his breath for as long as he or she wants, and enter a state of having a stilled mind, because this is another key concept of yogic practice, and particularly breath control. And it's very old. There's meant to be a direct connection between breath and the operations of the mind. So by stopping the breath, you stop the operations of the mind. Added to this, within the Hatha corpus, also is the notion that the vital energy, the vital force within the body, so this bindu in men, is also intimately, closely connected with the breath and the mind. And the idea is that if you can stop the movement of any one of those 3, you stop the other 2. This seems to some extent to be a principle of Hatha practice, in that if one enters a deep state of concentration, or is really focused on something, one will stop and hold one's breath. So if one holds one's breath, then one can enter a state of deep concentration and so forth. One is kind of reversing the normal flow of the body's activity as it's connected with the mind, in order to influence the mental processes. Okay, so that's the kumbhakas, the Hatha yogic kumbhakas. Now I'm going to talk about the last distinctive practice of Hatha yoga, and that's the mudras. They are variously enumerated, as I mentioned in previous sessions. In the very earliest text, of Hatha Yoga, the Amrita Siddhi, there are just 3. The Dattatreya Yoga Shastra teaches 9. The Shiva Samhita teaches 10. And then the Hatha Pradipika has 10, and then in fact 11, because it also teaches Yoni Mudra in another section of the text. Now, in the earliest teachings, again, as I discussed earlier, the purpose of the mudras is to control the breath and also the vital energies, i.e. bindu or rajas. In subsequent texts, so from the Shiva Samhita and Viveka Martanda and Hatha Pradipika onwards, these techniques are also said to awaken, stimulate Kundalini and make her rise up the central channel. Now, I don't think one should draw too much of a distinction between these different principles, in that I think that the mystical experience throughout many traditions, not just in India, is often seen as an ascent, and when that's predicated upon the body, it's seen as a rise, an ascent up the central column of the body. And what's rising may change, but I think the general principle and experience is probably something similar that's going on. So whether it's the breath or the bindu or the kundalini, mystical experiences are often explained as the rising of some vital principle up the central channel of the body. Now these techniques for bringing this about, the three first taught in the Amrita Siddhi and then found in almost all subsequent Hatha texts are called the Mahamudra, Mahabandha and Mahaveda. The Mahamudra involves pressing the left heel at the perineum, extending the right foot and holding the big toe of the right foot with both hands. And then the Mahabandha involves applying locks. Bandha means lock. Mudra means seal. Okay, so I hadn't explained that earlier, and in many cases, actually, it's sort of quite appropriate because the mudras of Hatha Yoga kind of seal off a certain channel of the body. Mudras occur a lot in earlier Sanskrit texts, particularly those of Tantra, but they're quite different practices, often predominantly hand gestures. But there the sense of mudra as a seal is that it's the sort of imprint of a god or goddess who's being invoked, and that then brings about, the goddess will bring about a certain physical reaction. The Hatha Yogic mudras are quite different. Okay, so once in the Mahamudra position, you apply the locks both by contracting the perineal region of at the bottom of the spine, and the chin lock, and also drawing up the abdomen. And I'll talk a bit more about that because those locks then appear in different forms in subsequent treatments of mudra. And then finally, in the Mahaveda, the great piercing. Now this is a kind of key central practice to the Amrita Siddhi and also in subsequent texts, although it seems to kind of fall out of prominence, but it is the key practice in the first Hatha Yogic text. And I haven't completely understood how it's performed, but it seems to involve, in that text, it's probably how it's taught later, but it's phrased quite differently in the Sanskrit. And in subsequent teachings, it involves the yogi lifting his haunches, his sort of buttocks off the ground, and then dropping himself onto the ground, and thereby with his heel tapping the bottom of the central column, and that is said to make the breath rush upwards through the central column. So that's the first sort of important triad of mudras. We then find in a variety of texts the locks, three locks, which in some ways correspond to the Mahabandha. There's some confusion, they seem to come from different traditions, but the triad of locks are the Mula Bandha, so that's the root lock. Mula means root, so again it's this notion of contracting the perineal region. Then there's the Jalandhara Bandha. Now, Jalandhara is the name of a great siddha or adept. It's also a region in northwest India, closely associated with tantric practice. But it's also quite a nice sort of pun. It works as well because it can be interpreted as meaning holding water or holding liquid. And the Jalandhara Bandha involves pressing the chin down onto the chest. And that's understood as stopping the bindu that's dripping down from the top of the skull, and that stops it from dripping down into the stomach and being consumed by the fire there. And then there's the Uddiyana Bandha, which involves drawing the abdomen as far up and inwards as possible. It's actually the sort of preliminary, it's the position you have to adopt in order then to practice Nauli, the Shat Karma, which I discussed earlier. And in many texts, these bandhas are enjoined to be practiced once one has inhaled and is holding the breath, and they're meant to lock the breath in place. Particularly in the Amrita Siddhi goes into the most detailed description of what happens once the breath is locked, and then how it can then be forced to burst upwards and rise up through the central channel into the head. Another key important mudra is the Khechri mudra, which is taught in most detail in a text called the Khechri Vidya, which I edited and translated as part of my PhD. And in that, the tongue is turned back and up above the soft palate. There are sort of two purposes of this, or three perhaps. As a seal, it's seen again to seal the bindu in the head and stop it from dripping down. But then it's also seen as a method of tasting the amrita, or the nectar of immortality, which is also stored in the head. And then finally, it's said to raise kundalini as well. As I mentioned in an earlier session, that there's said to be a channel that joins the tongue with the base of the spine by putting tension on the tongue. That raises the base of that channel, breath rushes in and kundalini will rise up. And in fact, that is that's also there's another mudra which I mentioned in an earlier session, the Shakti Chalani, which means the stimulation of Shakti, i.e. the stimulation of the goddess, which is identified with kundalini. And that is simply the practice of pulling on the tongue in order to stimulate kundalini. So there's a kind of overlap between the practice of Khechri mudra and Shakti Chalani. Another important mudra is the Viparita Karani, so the reverser, the inverter. And that's not explained in much detail. It's just said you turn yourself upside down. And here the notion is that gravity is used to stop the bindu from dropping out of the head, or I suppose it's reinterpreted with kundalini to mean that gravity is used to pull kundalini down from the base of the spine towards the head when one's inverted. Then the last mudra I'll discuss now is Vajroli mudra, which actually is, it's really highly valorized in lots of Hatha yogic texts. It's often the last mudra to be taught, which in the way of Sanskrit texts often means it's the most important practice. Yet it's also quite often dismissed, even ignored in translations of Sanskrit texts on Hatha yoga, because it's seen as I think in one of there's a translation approved by Iyengar by someone called Hans Ulrich Rieker, I think, produced in the 70s, in which it's completely left out because it's said to be a practice carried out by debased tantrics or something like that. Now I've written at length on this, and it has quite a convoluted history. But originally, I argue that it's a technique, again, key to preserving celibacy, preserving the bindu. And it involves the way it's taught, the way it was practiced traditionally, is the yogi inserts a metal pipe up his urethra and then sucks in water and then other liquids occasionally enjoined to be drawn up. Now, what appears to be the purpose of this is it desensitizes certain erogenous zones and then enables the yogi to overcome the urge to ever to ejaculate. And that's certainly how it's been explained to me by traditional yogis in India today. But then, as we see the Hatha yogic corpus develop, and some of its practice get taken on by more sort of tantric or more Varmachara, perhaps one might use this idea of the left-hand tantric path, but tantric traditions in which sexual techniques are used. They then interpret it as a method of drawing of being able to have sex and then draw up the combined products of sexual intercourse. But I've argued, and I've had extensive discussions with urologists and so forth, and I've never met anyone who claims to be able to do it, that this is actually physiologically impossible, and this is the sort of tantrics somewhat fantasizing about Vajroli mudra. But it's seen as a very important practice within the text, and actually it has this interesting association with Raja Yoga. And I will talk a bit more about this in the next and final session. but there's this idea of the yoga for kings, because it's said in certain texts, and in one in particular, actually, it mentions Krishna in this capacity. So the god Krishna famously had 16,000 girlfriends in Dwarka, or did he even marry them in the end? I'm not sure, but there's one text that says it's thanks to his mastery of Vajroli Mudra that he was able to keep his 16,000 wives happy. So the notion is that through the practice of Vajroli Mudra, a king can, still have intercourse with all his wives, yet remain a yogi because he doesn't shed his bindu. And this association with Raja Yoga does get repeated in various different texts, and I think it's been downplayed in analyses of the history of yoga. Okay, so those are the most important mudras. Subsequent texts, so the Gheranda Samhita teaches 25 mudras, the Jog Pratipaka 24, and in fact often they are associated there actually with specific kind of mental attitudes, which is a sort of more closely tied in with how mudras are taught in the tantric corpus. So that kind of tantric feature does seep into these later descriptions of mudra. So that's I've now given a brief introduction to the various distinctive practices of Hatha Yoga. What I haven't discussed are the other practices, the more generic ones that are associated with all traditions of yoga. So in particular, meditative techniques. I mean, it's understood within Hatha Yoga traditions that if one masters the breath, or if one masters Bindu, then the mind will be controlled, and that's the key aim of yoga. But there are also detailed instructions on dhyana, for example, meditation, as a method of leading to samadhi. Dhyana can be performed in various different ways. A distinction commonly made in descriptions of dhyana, meditation, is between saguna, so dhyana with qualities, with attributes, and nirguna, dhyana without attributes or qualities. So saguna will typically involve meditating upon a image of one's chosen god or goddess and creating a mental image of that deity. And nirguna dhyana is sort of seen as superior, and it's meditating on a completely formless absolute. And the idea is that the mind will then take on the qualities of whatever it is that one is meditating upon. And then the final goal of yoga, samadhi, which is treated in great detail in Patanjali's Yoga Shastra. A lot of these methods are said to lead finally to samadhi. One in particular, the one that Swatmarama mentions as crucial in the stages of Hatha Yoga, is Nada Anusandhana. So this is a process of focusing in on the sounds that will arise internally through the course of yogic practice, and they get progressively more subtle. He lists the different kinds of sounds, starting off with great big booming drums, finally getting down to sort of tinkling bells and so forth. And by focusing on that internal sound, one will also achieve samadhi. So that's final samadhi. The texts of Hatha Yoga don't go into such detail about samadhi as we find in Patanjali, but it's still seen as the ultimate aim, in which the mind is stilled, and that allows other benefits to come forth. So that's the end of this session, treating the practices and techniques of Hatha Yoga. In the subsequent final session, I will discuss practitioners of Hatha Yoga, who practiced it, and why they practiced it.
Wise Studies presents The History and Practices of Traditional Hatha Yoga with Dr. James Mallinson, Session 5. In this final session, Jim describes the practitioners of Hatha Yoga and explains the ultimate purpose of the practice.
Welcome to the fifth and final session of this introduction to Hatha Yoga. In this session, I'm going to talk about the practitioner of Hatha Yoga, who did it, who does it to some extent, and also why they would do it, because the two things are closely connected. Now, as I think I've made clear over the previous 4 sessions, the practitioner par excellence of Hatha Yoga is the ascetic, the world renouncer. So this is a key figure in Indian social religious traditions. This person, normally a man, I'm afraid, in all our historical sources, again, the focus is almost always on men. We do have some instances of women doing it as well, but generally the renouncer is a man who has turned his back on normal society. He gives up familial relationships, usual kind of employment and so forth. He won't live in a house. He lives off alms. He renounces sexual intercourse, and I think I've shown how the methods of Hatha are kind of technology for dealing with that, for helping maintain the state of celibacy. And in the earliest traditions that we find, in which we find evidence of practice of techniques that are forerunners of those that then get codified as part of Hatha Yoga from the 10th or 11th century onwards, these traditions are those of the collectively known as shramanas, sort of strivers. And these are renouncers who appear to have originated in the Magadha, greater Magadha region of northern India, along the border with present-day Nepal. And so these traditions associated with Buddhists to some extent, but not really, since the Buddha actually renounced a lot of the Hatha-style practices, but Jains in particular. And then there are other traditions known as Ajivakas. Now these, at that period, were seen as separate from the kind of Vedic orthodox traditions. But even within the orthodox traditions of India, there's always been a tension between the householder and the renouncer. So, for example, the famous Bhagavad Gita, which teaches yoga, and Krishna is teaching Arjuna a method of yoga. But I think the kind of bigger picture, the contextual picture there of what's going on, is that the renunciate tradition, the renouncer tradition, these monastics who turn their backs on usual day-to-day religion, the Vedic religion, and usual day-to-day social living, they posed a threat to these Brahmanical traditions. And so the Bhagavad Gita can be interpreted on one level in saying that, as Krishna saying to Arjuna, that you don't need to renounce normal worldly life in order to achieve spiritual aims. And you do it by, he says it quite clearly, that the real yogi, the real renouncer, is not the person who doesn't live in a house and goes forth into the wilderness, is not the person who gives up on the ritual sacrifices that are part of the Vedic tradition. It's the person who actually just renounces desire for the fruit of their actions. So it's pretty clear who his audience is, who he's talking to there. And he says that the practices of yoga, they may be undertaken by the householder, by the normal person, but the purpose of them is to achieve this sort of state of equanimity in which you will carry out your birth-given duty, so it's kind of reinforcing the social order. You'll carry out that duty, but you will have no regard, you will have no desire or concern about receiving the rewards of your actions. So that sort of sets sets the tone for the notion of the householder yogi throughout the Indian tradition, which survives to this day. So even within mainstream Hinduism, we might call it, although in that time it wasn't known as Hinduism, we find from an early period the notion of the renouncer who turns his back on society. Another way that the Orthodox tried to kind of subsume this notion within regular religious lifestyle was by creating an order, 4 successive stages of life, with the renouncer, the person who concentrates on spiritual practice, coming at the end. So you're meant to have carried out your duties as a householder, as a family person, have had children, have done your religious duties, have had a career, carried out your castely duties, and then you may walk out and renounce everything. But this actually, even to this day, within the ascetic traditions, within the renouncer traditions, such an approach is frowned upon, and they certainly valorize. They say that either you should be a yogi from early on, or you shouldn't really do it at all, because you should never abandon your family. So this tension between the householder and the renouncer has been really an important feature of Indian religious traditions from a very early period. And it's the renouncer who has always been seen as the yogi par excellence, really, even within the textual traditions, despite the protestations of the Bhagavad Gita and so forth. And those traditions, they continue. We can kind of see an unbroken lineage all the way through from that early period, the centuries BC, when we get evidence from the Buddhist Pali canon, from Alexander the Great's travels and so forth, of these ascetics carrying out practices that were forerunners of the Hatha Yoga of the second millennium. And then directly associated with Hatha Yoga itself are various sects of yogis which remain flourishing to this day. The great Kumbh Mela festivals, which happen every 3 years. This is when we see them all meeting together, converging. The main sects, there are 4 main sects amongst whom the practice of Hatha Yoga is really quite prevalent. But in fact, it permeates all religious traditions. But the kind of Hatha Yogis par excellence are found within a sect called the Dasnami Sannyasis. Dasnami means 10 names, so it's split into 10 different categories, and amongst their number are the famous Naga Babas, the naked sadhus who at these Kumbh Melas you often see pictures of them being beamed around the world as they run naked down into the river. Now, these sannyasis are famous for the practice of Hatha Yoga, and in fact, most of the famous gurus of yoga practice throughout the 20th century, and they're responsible for the spread of yoga to the West, come from the sannyasi orders. So Paramahansa Yogananda, Shivananda, Swami Satyananda, all these great yoga gurus are affiliated in some way or other with the Dasnami order. Another big order, perhaps the bigger even than the Dasnamis, is the Ramanandis. They haven't had quite such a sort of international influence, but amongst their practitioners, or amongst the ascetics of that tradition, we do find practitioners of Hatha Yoga, not a huge number. In fact, even within these ascetic traditions, the Hatha Yogis are rare, but they are held in great esteem. And I once sort of did a sort of survey. I think it was about 2%, 2 in 100 are kind of esteemed for their advanced practice of Hatha Yoga. But when you consider that there are tens or hundreds of thousands of these ascetics, that adds up to a reasonably large number. The next order of ascetics in which we find Hatha practice is the Nath Sampradaya. It's known as the Nath tradition. And they're often, if one reads secondary literature about Hatha Yoga, it's often said to be, they're meant to be responsible for its teachings, its origins and its practice and so forth. And they are to some extent. I'll talk about that a bit more, but I think that's been overblown. For example, the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, a text which I've talked about a fair amount, which is the first text to teach the practices of Hatha Yoga in a sort of formalized way, that's associated with the Dasnamis. It's nothing to do with the Naths. And in fact, while there are some early Nath texts teaching Hatha Yoga, subsequently they don't teach it in any detail, and none of the great modern gurus of yoga have been associated with them. And finally, of the big ascetic orders of India today, there's a sect called the Udasis, which are connected with the Sikhs, although there's been a sort of split over the course of the 20th century because Orthodox Sikhi doesn't like some of their practices, but amongst them too we find many exponents of the practices of Hatha Yoga. So that's just to show that it's still prevalent its practice amongst the ascetics of India, and B, it's not really associated in any way with a particular religious position or metaphysical dogma or anything like that. It goes across the board, and that's made clear in some texts. So, in particular, the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra again has a verse in which it said that anyone may practice Hatha Yoga. It says householders, also ascetics. Curiously, it uses the word shramana, which, as I mentioned, is the word for ascetics in the period of the Buddha, and is quite archaic by the 13th century, the time of the composition of the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra. But in addition to that, it says that you can be a karpalaka, which is a sort of skull-bearing tantric ascetic. You can be a Jain ascetic. It even says that you can be a charvaka, which is a type of, we might call it an atheist today. They believe in no afterlife and that good and bad acts have no effect. But somehow the text even seems to think that yoga will be good for them or will get them to where they want to go. A Buddhist too, it refers to Buddhists. This may be a kind of oblique reference to the Amrita Siddhi being a Buddhist text. It says that old people, young people, diseased people, anyone can practice yoga as long as they are devoted to the practice. That's the main thing. So the notion really seems to be that yoga will function regardless of one's metaphysical or philosophical outlook. And I think we can kind of see an inversion of the usual the usual idea put out about Indian religions, in which there are many paths and the goal is one. This rather suggests that there are many goals, but the path is one. So whatever your goal is, you can get there if you practice Hatha Yoga assiduously. Now, after that introduction, what I want to talk about now is how these techniques, which have developed within ascetic renunciate traditions, were then translated to a more general audience, to a householder audience. How I was once sent a picture of some very jungly-looking, ash-smeared, dreadlocked ascetic. I think maybe these Naga Babas actually are famous for doing things with their penises, which they'll sometimes at these Kumbh Melas, you'll see a guy pulling a truck with his penis, and that's meant to show that his penis is good for nothing. He's a complete renouncer. He's renounced sex. He's got total control over his organ and so forth. Which is another aspect of the fact that they will walk around naked because they are confident that they'll never get aroused, that kind of thing. They're meant to have complete mastery over sexual control. And I was sent this, it was a kind of mock-up advert type thing, and it was like, how did this become this? And then it was next to a picture of a sort of beautiful naked woman doing some yoga practice. So that's kind of a crude way of summarizing what I'm going to talk about now, because as I mentioned in the first session, in its earliest teachings, yoga is intimately associated with tapas, this notion of asceticism. It's quite hard in the epics, such as the Mahabharata. It's quite hard to kind of distinguish between tapas and yoga. They both seem to achieve the same ends. Often, yoga can be classified as a method of tapas, and vice versa. Tapas is mentioned in Patanjali as one of the observances to be carried out as preparation for yoga practice. But then, through the course of the sort of textual treatments of yoga, we see this attitude change somewhat. Tapas, when it's defined in early texts, is often associated with fasting as well as painful physical practices. But then by the time of the Hatha Pradipika, the yogi is told not to fast. He's told not to be too hard on his body. And then a few hundred years later, in a text called the Hatha Paddhati, which I mentioned a few times, it has these very interesting, detailed, lengthy descriptions of asanas. Tapas is actually completely redefined as being observing one's duty, one's sort of personal duty, i.e. one's caste duty that one's born to. So it's kind of completely doing away with this notion of tapas as something that's tough on the body. And I think this is because yoga is becoming something that is to be practiced by non-ascetics. And we see a similar kind of tension and perhaps transfer within the understanding of the techniques of yoga too. So originally yoga and tapas connected with drying up the body. We find frequent references to this, that yoga and tapas are achieved by means of fasting, of practices which create heat in the body. So there's the tapas of sitting in the hot sun surrounded by 5 fires, of making the inner flame in the body blaze up, the flame in the stomach, and thereby burn up the body to some extent, or cook the body. We find some texts that say, the body needs to be cooked before yoga can be perfected. Meanwhile, on the other hand, we find actually coming out of a less ascetic, more body-affirming tantric traditions, we find this notion of flooding the body with amrita, with the nectar of immortality, and kind of nourishing it and making it juicy and healthy and so forth. So we see a tension come in between these two approaches to practice, the kind of body denying and body affirming. And of course I think the body affirming one finally wins out, as it needs to, if yoga is to be taught to everyday householders rather than ascetics who are quite happy to mortify themselves. Similarly, the emphasis on celibacy, has to be reinterpreted to some extent, and so in texts such as the Vasishta Samhita, and we find similar notions in subsequent texts. Instead of brahmacharya, which is one of the observances taught by Patanjali as essential for yoga, and there is generally understood to mean absolute celibacy, then it's reinterpreted as meaning only observing, only practicing sexual relations with one's wife at the correct time, i.e., when one's wife is most fertile. So this is, reinterpreting the necessary observances and restrictions of yoga that are carried out by ascetics, but reinterpreting them for householders. And it's pretty clear from the early texts that the methods of tapas and yoga associated with ascetics are bad for the body. I mean, frequently they are associated with shosha or shoshana, which is the drying up or desiccation of the body, and that's actually included in Ayurvedic texts as a problem. This is something that you don't want to do, and that there are cures for it. Meanwhile, the ascetics are going out and deliberately doing it to their bodies. But then later on, as I've mentioned earlier, derived from tantric techniques, we find quite the opposite, the flooding of the body with amrita. And I think we actually see this quite clearly in two different attitudes or two different explanations of the kind of prime goal of yogic practice in two pretty much contemporaneous texts. So, and they're two early Hatha texts. One's the Goraksha Shataka, which I mentioned in the second session, and the other is the Khetri Vidya, which I've mentioned a few times. This is the text I edited for my PhD. So in the Goraksha Shataka, which is from this Nath tradition associated with Goraknath, we see the kind of ascetic approach to Kundalini practice. And this text, at its end, it says, it makes quite clear that it's intended for ascetics, not householders. It says, and also it kind of opposes itself to the tantric traditions too. So it says, rather than eat meat, we don't eat meat, we turn our tongues back and swallow them. We don't drink wine, we drink the nectar of immortality. We don't have sex, we unite the male and female principles within our own bodies. And this actually also is associated with a legend which is key to the Nath or Gorakhnati tradition of yogis, and which again illustrates this tension which is common throughout Indian religion. So Gorakhnath, who's now seen as the main teacher, the original teacher of yoga within the Nath tradition, his guru was called Matsyendranath. And Matsyendranath is associated with Kaula traditions of Shaiva Tantra, in which the kind of really hardcore cremation ground sort of skull-bearing practices of these sort of dangerous goddess-worshipping ascetics have been tamed, domesticated to some extent, but Matsyendra is still associated with tantric practices that involve sexual techniques and impure substances and the consumption of alcohol and so forth. So the famous legend is that Matsyendra was trapped. Well, he'd gone travelling around India, and then he gets stuck in the Kadli Desha, which is a land populated only by women, and the queen won't let him leave. But I don't think he's objecting very much, because he's the one man in this kingdom, and he's surrounded by beautiful women and feasting and drinking and so forth. And then Gorakhnath gets to hear about this, travels down to find him. He's not allowed in because he's not a woman. He can't get into the kingdom, so he has to disguise himself as a woman. And then he goes in and he gets into the palace and he beats out this song on his drum, which makes the sound, well, in Hindi it's Jagmachandra Gorakh Aya, which means wake up, Matsyendra, Gorakhnath has arrived. And then suddenly Matsyendra comes out of his kind of haze of indulgence, and he comes to his senses and he escapes the kingdom with Gorakhnath. And that is understood as being a sort of allegory of the reformation of the Nath tradition by Goraksha, in which he imposes a more kind of celibate, hatha yogic style practice onto its earlier tantric traditions. And so this text, the Goraksha Shataka, seems to be emblematic of that, when at the end it says, we don't do these tantric practices, we are celibate yogis. And in the way that its Kundalini practice is taught, I think is emblematic of the kind of celibate ascetic approach to Hatha Yoga. So Kundalini, using various techniques, these bandhas, these locks, breath control, specific methods of inhalation and exhalation, and then specifically the Shakti Chalani Mudra, in which the tongue is pulled to awaken Kundalini, so she rises up the central channel and pierces 3 knots. There are 3 knots along the central channel, the first being the Brahma Granthi, the knot of Brahma, then you have the Vishnu Granthi, the knot of Vishnu, and then finally the Rudra Granthi, the knot of Rudra or Shiva. And then she gets through to Shiva, who is residing in the head, and she kind of unites with him, so it's the union of Shiva and Shakti, union of the male and female principles, and then they just sort of melt into one another and disappear, and that's it. Enlightenment is achieved. The yogi looks like he looks like he's dead, and he enters this state of complete samadhi, deep sort of catatonic state, and that's it. And that's the kind of final goal of the text. Now, of course, that's not what that's not really very handy for your average householder who then needs to get on with his life as well. You can't just enter this timeless, eternal state of deep samadhi. And so in the Khetri Vidya, which seems to be geared more towards householder traditions, and in a way that is echoed in subsequent texts, the raising of Kundalini is achieved through similar methods, through practicing the Khetri Mudra technique, in which the tongue is placed above the palate. So Kundalini rises up through the central channel. In that text, she goes through the chakras as well, and she reaches Shiva in the head, but she also she sports with Shiva. She has fun with Shiva at this lake of nectar, Amrita, the nectar of immortality. And she hangs out there for a while, but then she goes back down. She returns to her place at the bottom of the central channel. And as she does this, as she passes through each chakra, on her way down, she she's taken a load of the amrita from the store in the head and she floods the body with it. So she rejuvenates the body. She makes it young again. The text says she renders it immortal. I mean, this fluid is called amrita, the nectar of immortality. So on the way up, Kundalini is said to burn up the body. So this is kind of parallel to the ascetic methods of desiccation of the body. And the same is said in the Goraksha Shataka. As Kundalini rises, she consumes the nutrients and the vital constituents of the body. And that's it. And in the Goraksha Shataka, that's it. It stops and it's all done. And, the body's not left in a particularly good state. But in the Khetri Vidya, she comes back down again. So this is the kind of householder approach. It's also, interestingly, it's also the same techniques are associated with very central practice to a lot of Hatha yogic texts, namely the cheating of death, and also utkranti, which is usually translated as yogic suicide, and finally parakaya pravesha, entering into the body of someone else. Now these very apparently esoteric techniques are central to quite a lot of teachings on yoga in yogic texts. So the idea is we also find in plenty of texts long descriptions of what are called arishta, and these are the signs of death, the signs of approaching death. And so the yogi wants to know this so that he can be prepared for death's arrival. And these are, there are various ways of doing it. There are some sort of peculiar forecasting methods when you look at your reflection in a mirror or in a pool, and depending on how it looks, or depending on which channel the breath is flowing in, and so forth. Anyway, quite sort of lengthy esoteric lists of signs of how long you're going to live. But what the yogi who has mastered the raising of Kundalini up the central channel, what he or she can do is that if death is approaching, Kundalini can be raised up to the skull, and then, as I said, when Kundalini is there, the body looks completely lifeless. It looks as though the yogi is dead. So death arrives, checks out the yogi, goes, oh, hang on, my work's already done here, there's nothing for me to do, leaves again, and then when death's gone, the yogi can then send Kundalini back down to her seat at the base of the spine, rejuvenate, reawaken his body, and then get on with life as usual. There are other options too. If he or she wants, the yogi can project the Kundalini and the vital energy out of the top of the head, and that results either in utkranti, so ascent, or yogic suicide, i.e. death, and then moving on to the next life, or not moving on to the next life, to final absorption into Parabrahma, so into the ultimate Brahman, or the same technique can be used to enter another body. Now these are fairly, as I say, esoteric sounding methods, but they are central to a lot of teachings on yoga. These two approaches that I mentioned from the Goraksha Shataka and the Khetri Vidya, so the different approaches to the ultimate aim of yoga, they on their own, they make good sense. But as I mentioned in previous sessions, in the Hatha Pradipika and other texts, they get combined, so that creates some confusion. So the Hatha Pradipika, as does the Viveka Martanda, they teach two different sorts of Khetri Mudra. One in which the bindu, the vital essence, is to be sealed in the head, so the action of the tongue going back seals it in the head, whereas in the second version of Khetri Mudra that they teach, it corresponds to the Khetri Vidya's idea of Kundalini rising, accessing Amrita, and then flooding the body with it. So this tension between life-affirming, life-denying, ascetic, renunciatory, and householder, more positive, life-affirming traditions is found even within an individual text. But as I've said earlier, the Hatha corpus kind of shows us a progression in its attitude towards householders practicing yoga. In the earliest Hatha text, the Amrita Siddhi, which which is probably 11th century, which I discussed in the second session. Practitioners of yoga are divided into 4 categories, 4 grades. And the lowest category, the lowest grade, the lowest practitioner is said to include people who are diseased, weak, old, lacking in energy, and living in houses. Okay, so living in houses is sort of code for a householder, a person who's married. And it's said that they will take longer than everyone else. They'll take 12 years just to advance through one of the 4 stages of yoga. Now, that same verse, or that same passage, is taken and used in a text called the Shiva Samhita, which is probably 2 or 3 centuries later, and it takes lots of verses from the Amrita Siddhi. But the Shiva Samhita is very much more written from the point of view of the householder. So it takes that same verse, but it doesn't include the bit about living in a house. And actually, at the end of the text, it says very, very clearly that the householder who lives in a house together with his wife and kids and so forth, but still manages inwardly to practice yoga, he will achieve the ultimate state. He will achieve liberation. So there we see a kind of reversal of the social outlook in these 2 texts in the space of a couple of hundred years. So this process of Hatha Yoga being a kind of translation of ascetic yogic techniques to practices that can be undertaken by everyone is kind of is exemplified by the practice of Vajroli Mudra, or at least its treatments in text, as I mentioned in the previous session. In that, the way I understand it, originally Vajroli Mudra was seen as a method of cultivating celibacy for yogis, so that they would never lose their bindu. And in fact, it was explained to me once by one Dasnami ascetic at Gangotri in the Himalaya, that it was essential to learn Vajroli Mudra in order that the yogi does not shed his bindu when Kundalini rises. So if Kundalini goes through as she goes through the Swadhisthana chakra, he said if one did not have complete mastery of Vajroli Mudra, then the yogi would involuntarily shed his bindu, and all would be lost. It's a disaster for the celibate Hatha yogi. But it then becomes sort of repackaged as the texts orient themselves towards householder practice. It becomes repackaged as something that, if the yogi, or if it's mastered by anyone, then they can have as much sex as they like, but still get the benefits of their yoga practice. So this seems to be a way of packaging Hatha Yoga for the householder. Now I wonder, something that puzzles me in my research on this subject is the fact that we never actually get any historical reports or paintings or sculptures or anything, any evidence of householders actually practicing yoga prior to the modern period. Even though the texts say they can do it, there's no evidence of them actually having done so. I mean, I know of kind of, one obscure reference to the Khiljis, which was a Mughal dynasty of nobles, being intrigued by yogis who could, who apparently had control over their continent, so they wanted to ask them about those skills. And again, I think the main reason then was they thought it would help them with their sex lives. It didn't seem to have much kind of higher purpose to it. And also one wonders, what's the point of, why are these some of these techniques are obviously not to be undertaken by the faint-hearted, such as Vajroli Mudra. And I think, the texts are still written from the point of view of, or with the view that the ascetic practitioner is, the yogi par excellence, and that the the householder may aspire to some of these practices, or may aspire to be a great yogi, and will partake of some of the practices, but not all of them, in the hope of achieving at least some of the available benefits. I mean, I compare that to, a sort of average yoga practitioner going to a yoga class and watching his or her yoga teacher do some amazing asana or something, and never having a hope of copying them, but then just trying something a bit easier and gaining some benefit from that. So perhaps that's what's going on here. So to recap here, I started off by looking at I started the first session by looking at the meaning of the word hatha, and I think that by exploring that has really demonstrates that the history of hatha practice and its techniques, in that it starts off being closely associated with ascetic practice, and that, as I mentioned again in the first session, that is really how it's understood in India today. The Hindi word hat, which is the Hindi form of hatha, is seen as it's a really hardcore practice. If you really throw everything you've got at something and you really strive for it, that is the understanding of hatha yoga. Meanwhile, again, as I mentioned in the first session, that doesn't really sit very well with the practices of yoga being translated for a non-ascetic, a non-renunciatory audience. So people who can't do it all the time, can't do it full-time, have got other lives to live. They're not going to be full-time yogis. Okay, so this is why we find these reinterpretations of the word hatha. In particular, the one that first appears in a text called the Yoga Bija. Yoga Bija means something like the seed of yoga. And here we have this notion that hatha is nothing to do with this meaning of force or stubbornness or really striving to do something. It's simply the combination of the two syllables ha and ta, the union of the sun and moon. Ha corresponds to sun, ta to moon. Yoga means union, so hatha yoga is the union of the sun and moon, where the sun and moon can be understood as various different opposite complementary principles within the body, such as the in and out breath, or the left and right channel, or the sun, which is located in the stomach, and the moon in the head, associated with the lunar nectar. So that rather encapsulates the development of hatha yoga within the Indian tradition. Its progression from being a difficult, intense practice to be undertaken by ascetics to something more suited to householders who can't be full-time yogis and who don't want to mortify their bodies and so forth. And then I think it's interesting. Now I don't see myself as an expert on modern yoga practice at all, but I've recently been made aware of, because I deal with the traditions of hatha yoga in India, how in globalized yoga traditions, hatha, as I'm told it's pronounced, seems to refer to actually, a relatively easy form. It's understood as a relatively easy form of yoga practice. Now, this, I found quite surprising when I first heard this, because obviously that's a direct contrast from the understanding of hatha within the Indian context, even if it does get somewhat diluted or softened in the later medieval period. But then I think, this just seems to be taking the same process further down the line. And I also think there's something, there's a joke in there which I haven't yet formulated, but the fact that it's pronounced hatha in modern globalized yoga, as opposed to the word hatha as it is in Sanskrit, also has there's something to be said about that, in that when one writes the Sanskrit word transliterated, i.e. in Roman script, Hatha, one has to put a dot underneath the T, so for hatha, because it's a retroflex T. You turn your tongue back against the roof of your mouth to say the ta, and then it's aspirated to make the h sound, so hatha. Okay. Now, by taking away the dot, as is normally done, it's understandable that people who don't know Sanskrit or Hindi when reading it are going to pronounce it as hatha. But another word for a dot in Hindi or Sanskrit is bindu. So it seems to me that somehow this whole emphasis on preserving the bindu has been removed from the understanding and practice of Hatha Yoga, and as a result it's changed from Hatha to Hatha. But it seems to be having excellent benefits on lots of people, so I see this as just a natural progression in Hatha Yoga's historical development. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to the history and practices of traditional Hatha Yoga with Dr. James Mallinson. You can find more in-depth contemplative audio courses at wisestudies.com. At Wise Studies, we are committed to illuminating the texts and teachings of the world's great contemplative traditions. Thank you for listening.